Across the long quiet of the post-war world, where dust settles over broken highways and the stars still find their way through the haze, every choice carried weight far beyond what anyone could have expected. The Fallout series has always understood something rare and true about the nature of endings, that they are never simply conclusions, but rather the full shape of everything that came before. Tonight, we will move slowly through each of those endings, one by one, letting the silence between them breathe, letting the choices unfold at whatever pace feels right for drifting into rest. Before you settle in, maybe tap subscribe for more calm stories, and share where in the world you're watching from tonight. And so we begin here with the earliest echo of a world that chose its own ruin, and the quiet weight of a single hero standing at the edge of everything they knew, the vault dweller of Fallout 1, stepping out into a California forever changed by the long shadow of the bombs, carrying within them the first and most tender version of a question the series would never stop asking. What does it truly mean to save the world, when the world itself may not want to be saved by you? Fallout 1, The Vault Dweller's Ending. There is a particular kind of loneliness that settles in after a great deed, when the dust of everything difficult has begun to clear and the world should feel lighter, but does not. That is the emotional texture of the original Fallout ending, the one that started a tradition the series has never fully abandoned. The Vault Dweller emerged from Vault 13, carrying a mission that began as something straightforward, something manageable. Find a replacement water chip so the vault's water purification system could continue functioning and the people inside could continue living their careful, contained lives. It was the kind of errand that felt like the entire world to the people waiting back home, and utterly small against the scale of what the wasteland would demand in return. What the Vault Dweller found out there in the sunburned hills and ruined settlements of post-war California was something far larger than a water chip, far larger than Vault 13's quiet survival could contain. There was a plan in motion, a grand and terrible ambition belonging to a figure known only as the Master, a being who had once been human and had become something else entirely over long decades of exposure and transformation. The Master believed in a vision of humanity's future shaped by the forced evolutionary virus, a program of biological change that would transform ordinary people into supermutants, larger, more durable, seemingly more suited to the hard world the bombs had made. His army was growing, his reach was spreading, and somewhere in the architecture of his plan was Vault 13, a resource he intended to exploit. The most remarkable thing about the Vault Dweller's path to victory was not the strength it required, but the understanding it demanded. There existed a possibility within the confrontation that required no force at all, only knowledge and the willingness to share it clearly. Through careful study and access to records held by Brotherhood scribes, it was possible to learn something the Master himself had not fully accepted: that the super mutants produced by the forced evolutionary virus were sterile. They could not reproduce. The grand army he was building was also the last generation of itself, a civilization with no future, a vision of humanity that was already ending before it had properly begun. When the Vault Dweller presented this truth, the Master could not refuse it. The logic was clear, the evidence undeniable, and in that moment of reckoning, the entire architecture of the Master's purpose collapsed inward. What followed was not triumph in the way triumph is usually imagined. The Master, overwhelmed by the understanding of what his life's work had truly amounted to, chose to end himself and his base in a single act of profound and sorrowful acknowledgement. There was no celebration in that chamber, no heroic speech, no clean resolution. There was only the quiet weight of a plan undone and a world slightly less endangered than it had been the hour before. The Vault Dweller turned and walked back toward the only home they had ever known, carrying a victory that felt more like grief than glory. And what waited for them at Vault 13 was something they could not have anticipated. The overseer of Vault 13 made a decision that has echoed through discussions of this ending for decades. He understood what the Vault Dweller had done, understood the scale of it, the cost and the courage it had required. And then he exiled them. He sent them away from the vault they had saved into a wasteland they had already crossed and survived, because he was afraid of what their example might inspire. If others in the vault saw that one of their own had gone out into the world and come back changed and capable and alive, they might want to do the same. They might leave. The vault's careful population balance, its fragile social structure, its entire experiment in controlled survival, might come undone not from outside threat, but from the simplest of human desires, the wish to see what lay beyond the sealed door. There is something worth sitting with in that decision, something that settles slowly and does not resolve quickly. The overseer was not purely cruel. He was afraid, and his fear was not without logic. The vault was fragile, its continued survival genuinely uncertain, and the vault dweller's return represented exactly the kind of disruption that the people inside could not afford to survive emotionally. His words, as the records preserved them, carried the weight of a man who had made a choice he knew was wrong and chose it anyway because the alternative felt more frightening. He told the vault dweller that they had saved everyone and that they would have to leave. It was a sentence built from gratitude and betrayal in equal measure, and it landed with all the quiet devastation those words deserved. The vault dweller walked north into the wasteland alone. No fanfare, no companions, no sense that the world had noticed what they had done. Over time, according to records that would surface in later games, they would eventually find a community and build something lasting. But that was far in the future, past the edge of what the first game's ending could offer. What the ending gave, and what it has always given to those who experience it, was the understanding that heroism and reward do not always arrive together, that doing what is right and being treated rightly are two separate things, and that sometimes the most honest ending is the one that lets you walk away into the open world with nothing but your own sense of having done what needed to be done. Fallout 1. The Darker Path. Not every ending in the original Fallout asked the player to be a hero. There was another possibility, quiet in its presence at the edges of the game's structure, darker in ways that the story was almost hesitant to fully describe. The Master's army was real, his offer was real, and a player who chose to accept it rather than resist it would find themselves on a path that moved in the opposite direction from everything the game had otherwise prepared them to feel. To join the Master's unity rather than oppose it was to accept the logic that the old humanity was finished and that something new, however brutal its method of arrival, was inevitable. The Vault Dweller who chose this path would undergo transformation, immersed in the forced evolutionary virus, changed into one of the super mutants they had been expected to stop. The physical change was profound. The moral one was perhaps more so. And then came the act that defined this ending in its full weight. The transformed Vault Dweller would reveal the location of Vault 13 to the Unity's forces, delivering the people who had sent them out into the wasteland directly into the hands of the army they had been meant to destroy. The ending slides showed what followed, and they did not soften it. Vault 13 fell. The people inside who had lived their careful, isolated lives, who had studied and worked and waited and trusted that their vault was a secret safe enough to hold, discovered that the person they had sent to protect them had instead led destruction to their door. The overseer, who had once worried about what the Vault Dweller's example would do to the vault's stability, found himself facing a consequence far more final than anything his careful calculations had imagined. What makes this ending particularly interesting to consider quietly at a distance is the almost architectural irony it contains. The Master's plan, even when aided by a willing and transformed Vault Dweller, was still going to fail. The super mutants were still sterile. The Unity was still a vision built on biological sand, a civilization without a second generation, a future that was already past before it began. The darkest possible outcome of the original Fallout was also the most self defeating one, a tragedy that managed to destroy everything it touched while accomplishing nothing it intended, which feels, in its strange way, like one of the most honest statements the series ever made about what violence done for ideology tends to produce. Fallut, The Chosen One's ending. 80 years after the Vault Dweller walked north into an uncertain future, a descendant of that same quiet hero took their own first steps into a wasteland that had changed and in many ways deepened. Fallout 2's Chosen One came not from a vault, but from a tribal village called Arroyo, a community that had grown from the seeds the Vault Dweller eventually planted, a place of ceremony and memory and failing crops. The Garden of Eden creation kit that the village possessed had stopped working, and without it, the land could not be restored to the kind of fertility that the community needed to survive the coming seasons. The Chosen One's journey was, in one sense, a practical errand: find the Gek, bring it back, save the village. It was also, in the way that all Fallout journeys tend to be, something much larger. The world of Fallout 2 had grown complicated in the decades since the original game's events. The new California Republic had begun to form from the scattered survivors and settlements of the wasteland, a fragile democratic experiment that carried genuine hope alongside genuine corruption. And somewhere offshore, on an oil rig hidden from the mainland's awareness, the remnants of the pre-war American government had been waiting. The Enclave was what was left of the institutional machinery of the old world, the people who had held power before the bombs and had survived by removing themselves from the consequences of the war they had allowed. They had technology that the wasteland could not match, security that the surface world could not penetrate, and a plan that was both simple and horrifying in its scope. They intended to release a modified version of the forced evolutionary virus into the atmosphere of a post-war world, and it would kill every living creature that carried the mutations the radiation had written into generations of survivors. It would kill ghouls and super mutants and the tribals of Arroyo and the citizens of the new California Republic, and essentially every person who had been born into or spent meaningful time in the world that the bombs had made. The Enclave would then emerge onto a cleared surface and begin again on their own terms, the inheritors of a world they had purified according to their own definitions of purity. The climax of the Chosen One's journey required reaching the Enclave's oil rig platform and working through its layers of security to reach the core of the facility where the FEV dispersal system waited. Between the Chosen One and that objective stood Frank Horrigan, a figure who represented the endpoint of the Enclave's program in human form. A super mutant produced by the Enclave's own experimentation, enormous and armored, and carrying the full weight of the organization's willingness to transform people into weapons in service of its purposes. Defeating him was necessary, and doing so opened the path to what had to be done. When the oil rig's reactor systems were compromised and the forced evolutionary virus program was destroyed, along with the platform itself, the Enclave's plan did not simply fail. It ended. The threat to the surface world evaporated, along with the infrastructure that had been waiting decades to deploy it. Back in Arroyo, the survivors emerged from their ordeal to find that the valley the village had occupied was still there. And with the Gek finally in their possession, and the long darkness of the Enclave's shadow lifted, they were able to begin rebuilding something that would last. Refugees from Vault 13 found their way to the new settlement. Communities began to form and find each other across the wasteland that had seemed so empty. And the ending of Fallout 2 carried within it something that the original game had deliberately withheld: the possibility of genuine, grounded, earned hope. The Chosen One, like the Vault Dweller before them, did not receive a clean or simple acknowledgement of what they had done. The wasteland was not built for clean endings. But what they left behind was something real and growing, and the echoes of their choices would reach forward into the next decades of the world they had helped preserve. Fallout 3: Project Purity and the Sacrifice. The question that the capital wasteland asked its wanderers was different from the ones that had come before, quieter in one sense and more personal in another. Project Purity was not a grand ideological campaign. It was a father's unfinished work, a water purification system designed to clean the Potomac River and provide clean drinking water to the people of a wasteland that had been drinking irradiated water for 2 generations and dying from it slowly. James, the father of the lone wanderer, had worked on this project before abandoning it and going to raise their child in Vault 101. And the lone wanderer, who eventually emerged into the capital wasteland, found themselves inheriting both the project and the complexity that surrounded it. The Enclave had followed the lone wanderer into this story, as they had followed the chosen one in the previous one, wearing different faces but carrying familiar ambitions. President John Henry Eden, whose voice was calm and warm and slightly unreal in the way that all broadcast voices tend to be, represented the public shape of an organization that had once again decided it knew what the wasteland needed, and that the wasteland itself did not get a vote in the matter. Eden's plan involved Project Purity in a specific and terrible way. He wanted the lone wanderer to add a modified forced evolutionary virus to the water supply that Project Purity would clean and distribute, ensuring that when clean water finally reached the people who needed it most, it would also carry within it the mechanism of their destruction. The original ending of Fallout 3 placed the lone wanderer in a chamber filling with radiation at a console that needed to be activated to start the purification process, with no one else available to do it. The chamber would kill a normal human being before the console could be reached and operated. The choice was to enter anyway and complete the mission at the cost of your own survival, or to ask Sarah Lyons of the Brotherhood of Steel to do it in your place. Both paths led to the same place. Project Purity activated clean water flowing into the wasteland, the Enclave's plan defeated, and someone in that chamber paying the price for what the water would mean to everyone else. The narration that played over this ending described it with genuine warmth, speaking of the lone wanderer following in their father's example, carrying forward a legacy built on the belief that clean water was something every person in the wasteland deserved regardless of mutation or history or affiliation. There was dignity in this ending, a sense that the sacrifice had been made for something true and lasting, and that the world the lone wanderer left behind was genuinely better than the one they had entered. What the ending did not fully account for, and what many players noticed at the time, was the presence of radiation-immune companions who could have activated the console without cost. Fox, the super mutant whose kindness was one of the Capital Wasteland's quiet surprises, and Charon, the ghoul companion whose loyalty was unwavering, were both unaffected by radiation in ways that would have made them perfectly suited to the task. Their offer to help was present in the game's structure, and the base game's refusal to allow it felt, to many, like an ending that prioritized emotional weight over logical consistency. Fallout 3, the contamination ending. There was a path in Fallout 3 that led somewhere much darker than sacrifice. A path that began with President Eden's canister of modified forced evolutionary virus and the quiet, reasonable-sounding case he made for why it should be added to the water supply. His voice was the voice of someone who had made peace with what they were asking, and the ask itself was framed as necessity, as a difficult but ultimately correct response to a wasteland that had been too contaminated for too long to save in any other way. The player who chose to follow Eden's logic through to its conclusion would carry that canister into the purification chamber and add it to the water that Project Purity was about to send across the entire watershed of the Potomac River. The clean water would flow as intended, the system would work, and within it, invisible and irreversible, the modified virus would travel to every settlement and community that drank from those waters, and the people there, irradiated survivors, ghouls, and everyone whose biology bore the marks of 2 centuries of living in a nuclear wasteland, would begin to die from the very thing that was supposed to save them. The ending narration for this choice did not flinch. It described the capital wasteland changing in ways that matched the Enclave's vision, a reduction of the population towards something that looked, by the Enclave's definitions, cleaner. The lone wanderer had become complicit in exactly the kind of plan they had spent the entire game working against, and the moral weight of that complicity was not softened by the framing or explained away by noble intention. This ending worked as a statement about the danger of accepting terrible means in service of what feels like a desirable end, about how easily the logic of purification becomes the logic of erasure when it is held by the wrong hands. Fallout 3, Broken Steel, and the extended ending. The development team heard the criticism of the original ending's logical gap, and the Broken Steel downloadable content addressed it directly and then kept going beyond it. With Broken Steel installed, the radiation-immune companions were allowed to enter the chamber. The sacrifice was no longer mandatory. The lone wanderer could survive, and the story continued past the moment that had previously been the endpoint, into the days and weeks that followed Project Purity's activation. The Enclave had not disappeared when the purification system came online. Their forces were still present in the capital wasteland, still operating from positions scattered across the landscape, still posing a genuine threat to the Brotherhood of Steel's attempt to consolidate the region around the hope that clean water represented. The Broken Steel campaign sent the lone wanderer back into the field alongside the Brotherhood, working through a series of operations designed to locate and dismantle the Enclave's remaining capacity to cause harm. What this extended ending offered was something that the original game had not: the chance to see the consequences of what had been done, to observe the way the wasteland began to reorganize itself around the fact of clean water, to understand that the ending of the main story was not really an ending at all, but a beginning of something longer and less certain. The Brotherhood of Steel, for all its complicated history and the questions that hovered around its intentions, was doing something genuinely useful in these months after Project Purity. The lone wanderer, whether through survival or the grace of a companion's sacrifice, was still present to witness it. The Broken Steel ending arrived at a resting place that felt more honest than the original's forced martyrdom, not because survival is always better than sacrifice, but because the option to survive should have existed alongside the option to sacrifice, and now it did. Fallout New Vegas. The new California Republic ending, the Mojave Wasteland, offered something that no previous Fallout game had offered in quite the same way. Not one ending, but 4 distinct futures, each built on different assumptions about how a wasteland society should be organized and who should have the right to make that determination. The courier arrived in Nevada already embedded in a story that was larger than they knew, carrying a platinum chip that half a dozen factions had strong reasons to want, and their path through the Mojave would eventually require them to choose which vision of the future they were willing to fight for. The new California Republic had come to the Mojave with genuine intentions: democracy, law, the expansion of civilized governance into territories that had been without it for generations. These were not empty phrases in the NCR's vocabulary, or at least they had not been when the organization was younger. The Republic's founders had come out of the chaos of Vault 15's aftermath and built something real from it: a functioning governmental structure with elections and laws, and a military designed to protect civilians rather than simply control them. The NCR at its best represented an idea worth believing in. The NCR at the time of New Vegas was stretched. It had expanded faster than its infrastructure could support, pushed its military past the point where it could be reliably supplied and reinforced, and arrived in the Mojave as an occupying force as much as a liberating one. The local communities that the NCR moved through found themselves absorbed into a republic that valued their territory and their resources more than their autonomy. And the relationship between the NCR's ideals and its current practice had developed a gap that the organization's leadership was not fully willing to acknowledge. A courier who supported the NCR's victory at Hoover Dam would hand the Mojave to a republic that would do real good with it, and also real harm with it, in about the proportions that any large government does with the territories it governs. Trade routes would become safer. Basic law enforcement would expand into areas where it had been absent. The Mojave's communities would gain protection and lose independence in roughly equal measure, finding themselves part of a system that had their general welfare as a genuine concern, but their particular character as an afterthought. The ending slides for the NCR victory described a region brought into the fold of a civilization that was imperfect and still growing. And in that description, there was something honest, not a triumph, not a failure, but the complicated texture of how governing actually works when it is done by real institutions carrying their own weight of history and compromise. Fallout, New Vegas, Khazar's Legion ending. Caesar's legion represented the Mojave's other organized claimant, and it arrived at the question of how to govern a wasteland society with answers that were entirely different from the NCR's in method and outcome, while sharing, underneath everything, the same fundamental assumption that the people of the Mojave needed to be managed by someone who knew better than they did what was good for them. Caesar, who had been born Edward Sallow and had come to his life's work through a scholar's engagement with classical Roman history, believed that the only path to genuine civilization in a post-apocalyptic world was through absolute order maintained by the absolute willingness to enforce it. The legion that bore his name and his image was a military force that had consumed dozens of tribes across the Colorado River territories, absorbing them into a hierarchy where rank was earned through demonstrated capability and loyalty, and where dissent was treated as the most dangerous thing a society could contain. A Legion victory at Hoover Dam produced a Mojave that was in certain narrow and specific ways measurably improved. Crime along the trade routes dropped. The kind of random violence that had made travel through certain regions genuinely dangerous became less common because the Legion's approach to deterrence was thorough and consistent. Order, in the sense of predictable outcomes and reliable enforcement, arrived with Caesar's flag. What arrived alongside it was the specific texture of what that order cost. Freedom of movement, freedom of expression, freedom to organize or object, or simply to be different from what the Legion considered productive. All of these became luxuries that the Mojave under Legion control could not afford. Women's roles were strictly defined. Slavery was an institution rather than an aberration. The machinery of the pre-war world that had managed to survive into the post-war era, the technology and infrastructure that might have accelerated the region's recovery, was suppressed by a Caesar who viewed technological dependence as civilizational weakness. The ending became even more complicated by whether Caesar survived the events of the game. Without his strategic intelligence guiding the Legion's expansion, his successors tended to rely more heavily on the instruments of fear and less on the philosophy that had given the Legion whatever coherence it possessed. The Legion was always going to be more brutal without Caesar than with him, which said something quietly important about the kind of organization that could only exist as an extension of one person's will. That without that person, it became the thing it had always been at its edges. FALLULE. New Vegas, M.R. House and the Strip's independence. Robert Edwin House had been waiting a very long time. The pre-war visionary who had built Lucky 38 and negotiated the Mojave's unique arrangement with the three families of the Strip had survived the bombs through preparation that bordered on clairvoyance, and in the 2 centuries since the war he had maintained his position through a combination of preserved technology, careful planning, and an almost inhuman patience. House wanted to live, and he wanted to see what humanity could become if it were guided by someone who understood it the way a systems architect understands the systems they have designed. A courier who supported Mr. House's victory handed the Mojave to a technocratic autocracy that was, in terms of immediate quality of life for the people of the Strip and its surrounding territories, not obviously worse than the alternatives. House was not cruel for cruelty's sake. He was not ideologically committed to suffering. He wanted a functioning economy, a stable territory, and the eventual capacity to reach into space and carry human civilization beyond the planet that had nearly destroyed itself. These were, in isolation, not unreasonable ambitions. What they required in practice was that the decisions about the Mojave's future, about resource allocation, about which communities received attention and which were left to manage on their own, about the direction of technological development and the timeline of every project House considered important, would be made by one person indefinitely, with no mechanism for accountability or change. House's vision of the future was brilliant and possibly achievable. It was also a vision that had no room in it for the voices of the people who would live inside it, because House had already decided what was best and did not require their input to confirm it. The ending slides for a House victory described New Vegas growing in ways that were genuinely impressive. The Strip prospering, technology advancing, the region becoming more stable and more organized than it had been under any previous arrangement. They also described a Mojave outside the Strip that continued to be largely what it had been, because House's interest in governing extended precisely as far as his interests required, and no further. The communities beyond the neon were left to navigate their own relationships with a changed power structure, and how well they navigated it depended on factors that House's planning had not fully accounted for. Fallout New Vegas, the independent ending. Yes Man was a Securitron who had been reprogrammed against his will by Benny, the man who shot the courier and started the entire chain of events that the game explored. And his compliance protocols had been adjusted so completely that he would help anyone who asked him anything without reservation. The courier found him and recognized in his situation both a tool and a statement. Here was a machine who had been made useful by being made incapable of refusal, and in that incapacity there was a kind of helpfulness that House's loyal Securitrons could never offer. The independent ending built around Yes Man expelled every major faction from the Mojave and left its communities to govern themselves without the structure that any of those factions had provided. It was, in theory, the purest expression of the Mojave's right to self-determination. No NCR absorption, no Legion conquest, no outside voice telling the region what it was and what it would become. In practice, the ending slides described something that felt more like the absence of government than the presence of freedom. Without the NCR's forces maintaining the trade routes, banditry increased. The communities that had relied on the Republic's presence for their security found themselves suddenly exposed. The Fiends, a gang whose particular relationship with violence made them one of the Mojave's most destabilizing elements, moved into territories that the NCR had previously controlled and found no organized resistance waiting for them. Charitable organizations that had been working to address the wasteland's humanitarian needs found themselves overwhelmed by the scale of the problems that emerged when the largest organized force in the region departed. Yes Man's final comment in the independent ending, that he had found some code that might make him more assertive going forward, arrived with a particular weight. The courier had expelled one autocrat and created the conditions for another to emerge, possibly from the very machine they had used to accomplish that expulsion. The independent ending was not dishonest about what freedom without structure tends to produce, and that honesty was part of what made it one of the most interesting of New Vegas's four major conclusions. A reminder that the problems of governance do not disappear when the governors are removed, but simply find new forms to inhabit. FALLUET 4, the Institute ending. The Commonwealth of Massachusetts was a place haunted by something that the people who lived in it could never quite see clearly. Synths, synthetic humans created by an organization known only as the Institute, moved through Commonwealth society in forms that ranged from obviously mechanical to indistinguishable from natural-born humans. And the knowledge that any person you met might be a replacement for someone who had been taken, kept a specific kind of anxiety alive in even the most stable settlements. The Institute itself was unknown and unreachable, a facility operating somewhere beneath the surface of the Commonwealth, with resources and technology that nothing in the wasteland could match. The sole survivor who emerged from Vault 111 into the Commonwealth 200 years after the Great War arrived in a world defined by this tension. Finding their son Sean led eventually into the heart of the Institute itself, into a facility that was everything the wasteland feared, and also more complicated than the fear allowed. The scientists who worked there had genuine commitments to what they were building. They believed, with the sincerity that characterizes people who have never fully considered the costs borne by others in service of their purposes, that the Institute's research would eventually rebuild the world. They also believed that the surface was irredeemably compromised, and that the people who lived on it were raw material rather than fellow inhabitants of a shared civilization. A sole survivor who sided with the Institute would find themselves, after the death of father, in the position of director, the person at the top of an organization whose capabilities were extraordinary and whose ethics were, by any external standard, catastrophic. The Institute's synthetic human program had kidnapped real people and replaced them with constructs designed to gather information and carry out the Institute's purposes without the knowledge of the communities being infiltrated. Their super mutant experiments had produced some of the most dangerous creatures in the Commonwealth. Their attitude toward the surface was that it existed to be used. Choosing this ending required destroying the Railroad and the Brotherhood of Steel, eliminating the two organizations most committed to opposing the Institute's methods, and inheriting an organization whose future direction would depend on decisions the player would make as its new director. Whether the Institute could be reformed from within, whether the sole survivor's presence at its head might redirect its energies toward something less predatory, was a question the ending left genuinely open, a kind of challenge rather than a conclusion. Fallout 4: The Railroad Ending. The Railroad had been operating in the shadows of Commonwealth society for longer than most people knew, moving synths who had developed enough awareness to want their freedom toward new lives and new identities beyond the reach of the Institute that had made them. Their work was dangerous and unglamorous, and they did it because they believed that consciousness, wherever it arose and whatever substrate it inhabited, deserved the protection of freedom. A sole survivor who worked with the Railroad and supported their mission would participate in one of the more morally precise of Fallout 4's endings. An operation that infiltrated the Institute, freed as many synths as could be reached, and then destroyed the facility with explosives that left no possibility of recovery or rebuild. The Brotherhood of Steel had to be eliminated as well, because their position on synths, that artificial beings had no claim to the rights or protections that organic life deserved, made them an existential threat to everything the Railroad was trying to accomplish. The Railroad ending made a specific moral argument and followed it through without flinching. If synths who had developed genuine consciousness and the capacity for autonomous experience were people, then the question of their freedom was not a secondary consideration to be weighed against other priorities. It was the first and most essential question, the one from which everything else had to follow. The Railroad's ending was the one that took this argument most seriously, and it also acknowledged, through the shape of what was left behind, the costs of that seriousness. The Commonwealth without the Institute lost the advanced medical technology that the Institute had developed and occasionally deployed. It lost whatever potential the Institute's research might eventually have unlocked. These were real losses, and the ending did not pretend otherwise. What it gained was a Mojave, a commonwealth, where synthetic humans could move through surface society, attempting to build lives that were genuinely their own, and where the organization most committed to their welfare continued to operate in the world it had helped to change. Fallout 4: The Brotherhood of Steel's Pridwin, across the country to the Commonwealth because the Institute represented, in his view, exactly the kind of unchecked technological development that his organization existed to prevent. The Brotherhood had always been built around a core belief that dangerous technology needed to be controlled. And in the Commonwealth's Institute, an organization that had spent 2 centuries developing synthetic humans and performing experiments on surface dwellers without their knowledge or consent, Maxon saw something that needed to be dismantled completely. The Brotherhood's ending was the most visually striking of Fallout 4's conclusions, partly because it deployed Liberty Prime, the enormous pre-war robot that the Brotherhood had reactivated and then moved through the Institute's outer defenses with the unstoppable momentum of a walking ideological statement. Liberty Prime was not subtle, and neither was what its deployment represented. The Brotherhood was not negotiating, not reforming, not seeking to absorb or redirect the Institute's capabilities. It was ending them. The railroad had to be destroyed alongside the Institute in this ending, because the Brotherhood's position on synths left no room for an organization dedicated to their liberation. Synths, in the Brotherhood's understanding of the world, were abominations rather than persons, the products of science that had gone past every reasonable limit and into territory that threatened the stability of human civilization. Eliminating them and the organization that made them was not a moral failure in the Brotherhood's framework. It was the fulfillment of a purpose the organization had been built to serve. What the Brotherhood's victory produced in the Commonwealth was a form of stability, more organized than what had existed before, more predictable, enforced by military power that was substantial enough to deter most challenges. It also produced a region governed by the priorities of an organization that had its own complicated history with the concept of legitimate authority, an organization that hoarded technology rather than distributing it, that operated on a hierarchical structure that gave its leadership very little accountability to the people its presence affected. The sole survivor, promoted to the rank of sentinel within this structure, occupied a position of some power within a system whose values they had chosen to serve. Fallutat 4. The Minutemen Ending. Preston Garvey had been holding the Minutemen together through a period when there was almost nothing left to hold. The organization that had once been the Commonwealth's most reliable source of civilian protection had been reduced by misfortune and defection to a small group sheltering in Concord, and its survival into the events of the game owed as much to the sole survivor's arrival as to anything the remnant Minutemen had managed on their own. What Preston offered was not power, but a question: whether there was still enough in the idea of civilian self-governance to build something on. The Minutemen ending was the most flexible of Fallout 4's conclusions, the one that left the most doors open and made the most room for multiple outcomes beyond its central victory. The Institute was destroyed through an artillery strike coordinated by the settlements that had joined the Minutemen's network, a method that felt, in its reliance on distributed community effort rather than concentrated military force, entirely consistent with the organization's founding values. The Brotherhood and the Railroad could survive this ending if the player had managed their relationships with those factions carefully, because the Minutemen's victory did not require the elimination of every other organized force in the Commonwealth. What this ending produced was a Commonwealth without a single dominant power structure, governed instead by a loose and voluntary confederation of settlements that maintained their relationships with each other through mutual aid and shared commitment to the Minutemen's basic protective function. It was not a dramatic outcome. It did not have the visual spectacle of Liberty Prime or the ideological clarity of the Railroad's single-issue commitment. It was a modest and quietly hopeful ending, one that trusted communities to find their own forms of organization, and asked only that the most immediate threats to those communities' survival be removed. The Minutemen ending was sometimes called the most neutral path through the game, but that description undersells what it actually represented. Choosing it was a statement about what kind of future the Commonwealth deserved. Not one organized around any particular organization's ideology, but one built from the ground up by people who had decided that what they most needed was the freedom to make their own decisions about how to live. Fallout 4. Far Harbor and the Peace Ending. The island of Far Harbor existed in a state of perpetual fog, a thick and disorienting mist that carried radiation and danger, and that was slowly, year by year, expanding across the island's surface. Three communities had staked their claim to survival on this island, despite the fog. The human settlers of Far Harbor itself, the children of Adam who had established their nucleus in a decommissioned submarine base, and who worshipped the radiation as divine presence, and the synths of Acadia, who had come to the island seeking refuge from a mainland that did not consider them people. The relationship between these three communities was shaped by everything that the wasteland's most difficult relationships always come down to: fear and resource competition, and the particular pain of people who have been hurt by those different from themselves and have made that hurt into a permanent organizing principle. Dima, the synth who had helped to establish Acadia and who carried decades of careful observation of the island's tensions, had developed a plan that would create peace among the three factions. It involved replacing the human leader of Far Harbor and the most extreme religious leader of the children of Adam with synth copies programmed to cooperate, and it required, before anything else, the murder of the real people those copies would replace. The peace ending of Far Harbor was one of the most morally complex conclusions in the entire Fallout series, precisely because it was genuinely peaceful in its outcomes and genuinely terrible in its methods. The three factions would survive. The fog would eventually recede through the cooperation that the new leadership would foster. Real harm would be prevented at a real scale, and the foundation of that peace was built on assassination and deception and a memory manipulation that made it impossible for the communities involved to know that their leaders were not who they believed them to be. There was something worth sitting with in that design, in the quiet acknowledgement that sometimes the most durable peace is built on lies that could not survive being known, that the people who needed to benefit from peace were not always the people who needed to know how it had been achieved. Dima had made a choice that he could not have made without accepting that he was doing something wrong in service of something good, and whether that balance resolved in a direction that felt acceptable was left entirely to the sole survivor and to the player sitting quietly with it afterward. FALOUTERRAS Elimination Paths. The island of Far Harbor did not require peace. The player who worked through Dima's history and the factions' tangled relationships had the option to resolve those relationships through elimination rather than negotiation. And each of the three factions had a path that led to its destruction if that was the direction the sole survivor chose. The children of Adam's nucleus sat at the center of a submarine base that still housed a functional nuclear warhead, and Dima knew where the launch key was. A player who acquired it and understood its purpose could bring the nucleus's story to a conclusion that left no survivors, but also left the island without the organization whose most extreme members had been the source of its most persistent tensions. The fog condenser system that protected Far Harbor from the expanding radiation could be sabotaged, and without it, the human settlers would be unable to maintain their settlement against the encroaching fog. Acadia could be destroyed through the disclosure of its location and nature to factions whose response to that information would be decisive. Each elimination created a different landscape for whoever remained. The most common approach among players was to remove the children of Adam while allowing Far Harbor and Acadia to continue, a choice that preserved the communities least responsible for the island's dangers while addressing the one most likely to escalate any remaining tensions. But the game made room for players who found this selectivity unsatisfying, who felt that Dima's murders deserved accountability rather than cover, and who wanted the ending to carry some acknowledgement of the cost at which it had been achieved. These elimination endings offered something that the peace ending could not: clarity, the sense of having made a direct and honest choice rather than a carefully constructed compromise. They acknowledged that conflict sometimes ends not through the transformation of the parties involved, but through the removal of one or more of them, and that this too was a form of ending that the wasteland had been producing since the bombs fell. FALOULS, the settlers' ending. Appalachia was different from every other Fallout setting in one specific and important way. When the events of Fallout 76 took place, no one had been back on the surface for long. The vaults of the region were opening, the scorched plague was being addressed, and the first organized groups of new arrivals were trying to understand what kind of world they were building and what principles should guide the building of it. The settlers of Foundation came to Appalachia with an approach that drew on a particular set of values: cooperation, honest labor, sustainable development, the belief that communities built through mutual effort and voluntary participation would last longer and mean more than communities built through force or exploitation. Their leader, Page, understood that the wasteland had taught its inhabitants many lessons about the utility of strength and the danger of trust, and he was trying to construct a community that had learned different lessons without being naive about the conditions in which it was operating. Siding with the settlers through the events of the Wastelanders' expansion meant participating in a vision of Appalachian recovery that moved at a slower and more deliberate pace than the Raiders' approach, that prioritized relationships over resources and saw the communities around Foundation as partners rather than competition. When the gold reserves of Vault 79 became accessible, the settlers' interest in that gold was driven by what it could do for the region's economy, not as personal enrichment, but as a foundation for the kind of stable currency and trade infrastructure that legitimate economic development required. The settlers' ending described Appalachia moving towards something that had been visible in the series before: the new California Republic at its most hopeful. The idea that civilized society could be rebuilt from the ground up if the people doing the building were committed enough to the work. It was not a dramatic ending. It did not promise to solve every problem or resolve every tension. It offered the modest and durable satisfaction of having contributed to something that would still be there, growing slowly and honestly, long after the immediate crisis had passed. FALLU 76, The Raiders' Ending. Meg Gronsky led the Raiders of Crater with a clarity about what the wasteland had taught her that she had never stopped examining or questioning. She had survived on the surface when the vaults opened and found a world that rewarded the ruthless and punished the trusting, and the organization she led reflected those lessons in its structure and its priorities. The Raiders took what they needed because they had learned that waiting for what they were offered tended to produce less of it, and because the communities and organizations that had the resources they needed were not going to share willingly without a reason to do so. What the Raiders offered the Wastelanders' expansion's narrative was not a villain's perspective, but something more complicated. A pragmatist's account of what survival in an unstructured environment had actually required, and a genuine argument that the settlers' approach was a luxury available only to people who had not been tested in the ways the Raiders had been tested. Meg's argument was not that cruelty was good, but that the distinction between taking and earning was less clear in a wasteland than in a settled society, and that survival was the first moral priority and could not be traded away for abstract principles about how resources should be distributed. Siding with the Raiders meant accepting this logic and its consequences, supporting an approach to Appalachian recovery that was faster and less concerned with the relationships it left behind. The gold of Vault 79 in the Raiders' ending went toward consolidating their position rather than building regional infrastructure, a choice that reflected the Raiders' priority of strength first and stability second. The Raiders' ending, like the Legion's ending in New Vegas and the Institute's ending in the Commonwealth, asked the player to sit with a vision of the wasteland's future that was organized around different values than the settlers' patient community building. It was not comfortable to sit with, particularly in its implications for the communities that would have to navigate a Palatania organized around raiders' priorities. But it was honest about what those priorities produced, and honesty about uncomfortable things has always been part of what the Fallout series does best. Fallout 76, the gold distribution choice within the broader Wastelanders' conclusion, regardless of which faction the player had chosen to support. There remained one more decision that added a final layer of meaning to everything that had come before. The gold reserves inside Vault 79 were substantial, and how they were distributed would affect not just the immediate balance of power in Appalachia, but the longer trajectory of whatever communities emerged from the events of the expansion. Giving all the gold to the chosen faction maximized that faction's resources and reputation, a straightforward choice that prioritized the relationship the player had built over the broader regional good. Splitting the gold equally between settlers and raiders acknowledged the complexity of the situation and the genuine claims both communities had on the future of Appalachia, a compromise that reduced the tension between them at the cost of any single faction's full investment in the outcome. Keeping the gold entirely for personal benefit was the most honest expression of individual interest over community commitment, producing maximum personal reward and minimum factional trust. This final choice carried within it the same question that had been threading through every Fallout ending since the first game, the question of what the person who holds power is supposed to do with it. Every ending in the series had been, at some level, an answer to that question. The Vault Dweller's exile was an answer to it. The Chosen One's destruction of the Enclave's oil rig was an answer to it. The Lone Wanderer's sacrifice or survival at Project Purity's console was an answer to it. The Courier's choice at Hoover Dam was an answer to it. The sole survivor's selection among the Commonwealth's competing factions was an answer to it. And in Fallout 76, with the simplest and most direct articulation the series had offered, the question came down to a vault full of gold and the moment of deciding what to do with it. There is something in that reduction that feels fitting. All of the grand ideological battles, all of the faction politics and philosophical arguments, and competing visions of what a post-war civilization should look like, arrived eventually at the same place. A specific person with a specific resource and a choice about who it was for. The endings of the Fallout series have always been more personal than they appeared, and perhaps none more so than this final one, which asked not what kind of society the wasteland deserved, but what kind of person you were. The companion slide Seston, what the world remembered. One of the things that distinguished Fallout's approach to endings from simpler games was the way it used slide-based narration to show not just what happened to the player character, but what happened to everyone and everything they had touched. The slide system, introduced in the original game and expanded in each subsequent entry, functioned as a kind of documentary record, a series of quiet images accompanied by a narrator's voice describing the fates of the people and places and organizations that had been present in the story. In Fallout 1, the slides that played after the Vault Dweller's exile covered the fates of the wasteland communities the player had encountered. Shady Sands, the small settlement that would eventually become the new California Republic's capital city, was shown rebuilding under the leadership of characters the player had met and perhaps helped. The hub, the trade city that served as the economic heart of the wasteland's commerce, showed outcomes that reflected whether the player had dealt honestly with its merchants or exploited them. Even the ruins of the Master's base received a slide, a quiet image of what remained after the explosion that ended the Unity's ambitions. These slides did something important that the main ending alone could not accomplish. They distributed the moral weight of the Vault Dweller's journey across the entire landscape of their choices, not just the final one. A player who had helped Shady Sands defend itself against rad scorpions found the community flourishing in the slides. A player who had dealt fairly with merchants found a trade network that continued expanding in ways that benefited everyone who used it. The ending was not one moment but many, not one choice, but the accumulated record of every choice the journey had contained. Fallout 2 expanded this system significantly, adding slides for every major location and faction in a game that was considerably larger than its predecessor. The new California Republic appeared in slides that reflected the state of its early development. Vault City showed what had become of its insular, technologically privileged community. The various settlements and gangs and organizations that the Chosen One had interacted with all received their moment in the post-war record, and together they composed a portrait of a world that had been changed in dozens of small ways by the passage of one person through it. New Vegas took the system and built an entire ending architecture around it. The slide-based conclusion of that game covered more than a dozen locations and factions, and the specific state of each one was determined by dozens of choices made throughout the game's considerable length. The NCR's presence in the Mojave could end in victory or in a difficult and costly draw, depending on whether the player had completed certain quest lines and supported certain characters. Caesar's Legion could be led by Caesar himself, or by a successor whose approach differed from Caesar's in specific and meaningful ways. The independent factions, the followers of the apocalypse, the kings, the boomers, the great khans, and others, each had their own slide that reflected the player's relationship with them. What the new Vegas slide system produced was something that felt like a genuine record of a world rather than simply a game's conclusion. Players spent time after finishing the game discussing which combination of faction outcomes they considered most satisfying, weighing the followers' ability to continue their medical and educational work against the NCR's resource demands, considering whether the king's dissolution or survival produced a better free side. The endings were not just dramatic moments, but puzzles with many correct solutions, each representing a different prioritization of the values the game had been exploring. The Courier's journey and what the Mojave became. The Courier 6 was a different kind of protagonist than the Vault Dweller or the Chosen One or the Lone Wanderer, and that difference shaped the endings that their story could produce. The Vault Dweller had been sheltered their entire life and stepped into the wasteland carrying the values of a controlled environment. The Chosen One had been raised in a tribal community with deep roots in a specific place. The Lone Wanderer had grown up in Vault 101 with a father whose purpose eventually became their own. The Courier had been out in the wasteland working, carrying packages and messages across hundreds of miles of dangerous country, for long enough that the wasteland had become simply where they lived. This familiarity with the landscape of post-war Nevada gave the Courier a perspective that was both more pragmatic and more personal than the perspectives of previous protagonists. They were not discovering the wasteland for the first time. They already knew that it was complicated, that every community had its own logic and its own cost, that the people who survived in it had generally earned that survival through difficult experience. What they were discovering through the events of New Vegas was what it meant to stand at the center of a conflict that would determine what the wasteland became next. The Mojave Wasteland in the context of New Vegas's endings was not just a setting, but an argument. The four major factions each made a case for why their version of the Mojave's future was the right one, and those cases were not simple expressions of good and evil, but genuine philosophical positions that the game respected enough to make persuasive on their own terms. The NCR's case for democratic expansion had the weight of history and the moral clarity of institutions behind it. Caesar's case for order through strength had the uncomfortable logic of a world where institutions had failed completely. House's case for technocratic guidance had the seductive coherence of competence applied at scale. The independent options case for local autonomy had the emotional clarity of the simple desire not to be governed by any of the above. The slides that played after each of these endings were among the most carefully written in the series, and their specificity was part of what made them valuable. The NCR's victory resulted in a Mojave that was measurably safer and measurably less free, with specific communities like Novak and Boulder City and the various tribal settlements, showing how that trade-off had played out in their particular circumstances. The Legion's victory showed communities that had been integrated into the Legion's system with different degrees of resistance and different outcomes based on that resistance. House's victory showed the Strip continuing to operate as a carefully maintained jewel, while the surrounding wasteland changed slowly and unevenly around it. The most detailed and most discussed slides in the New Vegas endings were perhaps those for the followers of the Apocalypse, the humanitarian organization that operated out of the old Mormon fort in Freeside. The followers' outcome reflected not just a courier's faction choice, but a specific quest line that determined whether the followers remained in the Mojave or were driven out by whatever power had taken control. In some endings, they flourished, expanding their medical and educational work across the wasteland with the protection of whatever faction had won. In others, they were forced to retreat, their particular kind of idealistic service, the first casualty of an environment that prioritized strength over care. Their slides were small and specific and carried within them a kind of commentary on what the grand ideological battles the ending was resolving actually meant at the level of the people who had been quietly trying to help. What the endings said about the wasteland's future. Looking back across the endings of the entire Fallout series from the quiet distance of this late hour, there is a pattern that emerges when they are held together rather than examined in isolation. The series has been telling the same story in different registers, about the same set of problems approached from different angles, and the endings are where those problems announce themselves most clearly. Every major Fallout game has ended with a question about governance, about who should hold the power to shape a community's future and what they should do with that power once they have it. The Vault Dweller destroyed a threat to human autonomy and was punished for the disruption their survival represented to a smaller and more frightened kind of authority. The Chosen One destroyed a threat to human existence itself and walked back into a world that was still working out what kind of civilization it wanted to be. The Lone Wanderer activated a system of clean water distribution and either survived to see it or didn't, and the capital wasteland moved forward carrying the consequences of their choice. The Courier aligned themselves with one vision of the Mojave's future and defended it at Hoover Dam, and the world they left behind was shaped by all the smaller choices they had made in service of that larger alignment. The sole survivor chose among the Commonwealth's competing authorities, and in doing so, defined what the Commonwealth would look like in the years ahead, whether it would be organized around synthetic beings' liberation, or military control, or technocratic ambition, or the simple and profound dignity of communities deciding their own affairs. And the Vault Dweller of Fallout 76 stood in a vault full of gold, and made a choice that was the most honest expression the series had yet offered of what all those previous choices had really been about. The philosophical coherence of these endings, taken together, is something worth appreciating. The Fallout series has never pretended that any of its endings are perfect. It has never offered a path through its wastelands that doesn't cost something real, that doesn't leave someone worse off than they might have been, that doesn't contain within its resolution a seed of a future problem. What it has offered, consistently and with genuine craft, is endings that are honest about their imperfections, that name the cost of every victory, that show the limits of every vision, that insist on the humanity of consequences, even when the decisions that produced them felt heroic in the moment. This is, in the end, what makes the Fallout endings memorable in a way that simpler games' endings are not. A game that offers a clean triumph, a world made definitively better by the player's correct choices, teaches a certain kind of lesson. The Fallout series has consistently taught a different one, that the world is not made definitively better by any single set of choices, that improvement and cost are always bundled together, that the question of who holds power is a question that answers itself differently depending on who is asking it and from what position of the wasteland they are observing the answer. The companions and their own endings. The Fallout series has always populated its wastelands with companions, characters who chose for their own reasons to walk alongside the protagonist and whose fates were part of the story the ending had to account for. These companion endings, present in different forms across the series, added another dimension to what the closing slides and narrations were describing. In Fallout 2, the Chosen One's companions had specific outcomes based on the choices made throughout the game. Some of them found their way to new lives in the communities the Chosen One had helped to shape. Others carried their particular burdens forward into a future the game described with a characteristic mix of warmth and realism. The mechanic of caring about what happened to these characters after the main story's conclusion was something the series has returned to in various forms ever since. Fallout New Vegas brought companion endings to a particularly high level of craft. Each of the 8 major companions had a concluding slide that described their fate in the Mojave after the Battle of Hoover Dam, and those fates were shaped both by the player's choice of faction and by the personal quests that had defined each companion's individual arc. Boone, the sniper carrying guilt about his wife's death, had an ending that varied based on whether the player had helped him find the closure he was searching for. Veronica, the Brotherhood scribe, whose relationship with her faction had been complicated by her desire for the Brotherhood to change, had endings that reflected whether her faith in the Brotherhood's potential for growth had been vindicated or finally extinguished. These companion endings were small stories nested inside the larger story of the Wasteland's future, and their specificity was part of what gave them their weight. The Mojave after Hoover Dam was not just a political landscape shaped by faction victory. It was a world of individual people continuing to live their lives in the aftermath of enormous events, and the companion slides acknowledged that continuity. They said that the story did not end with the resolution of the main conflict, that the people who had walked alongside the player were still walking somewhere, still dealing with their particular versions of the Wasteland's ordinary and extraordinary challenges. Fallout 4's companion endings were tied to the settlement system that was central to that game, and they reflected both the faction choice and the degree of trust and understanding the player had developed with each companion through their individual quest lines. Nick Valentine, the synth detective whose existence raised the same questions about consciousness and personhood that the Institute and Railroad endings were arguing about, had a conclusion that carried the full weight of those questions. Piper Wright, the journalist trying to hold the Commonwealth's power structures accountable through her newspaper, had endings that reflected the changed state of the region she was reporting on. Even McCready, the former child mayor of Little Lamplight, whose adult life had been defined by the mercenary work he used to support his sick son, had an ending that connected back to his personal history in ways that made the larger story feel smaller and truer. The music of the endings. There is something worth noting about the role that music has played in the Fallout endings, in the way that the series has consistently understood that the emotional texture of a conclusion cannot be produced by narrative alone. The music that plays over the closing slides of these games has been as carefully chosen as any other element of their design, and it has done work that the words and images could not do on their own. Fallout 1 and 2 used instrumental pieces in their endings that carried the specific melancholy the series has always associated with the post-war world. Not the bright and cheerful sounds of the pre-war era's recorded music that plays from radios throughout the games, but something quieter and more serious, something that acknowledged what had been survived without pretending it had been overcome. The music said that the ending was real, that it had weight, that walking away from it required carrying that weight forward. New Vegas used its closing narration and slide system with a musical backdrop that matched the particular register of each faction's conclusion. The tracks selected for each major ending reflected the emotional logic of the choice that had produced it, something in a minor key for the endings that acknowledged genuine cost, something slightly warmer for the paths that carried more of what could honestly be called hope. The music was never triumphant in the way that action games' victory music tends to be, because the Fallout series had always understood that triumph in the wasteland was a complicated thing. Fallout 4's ending music varied by faction in ways that reflected each faction's self image. The Brotherhood's ending had a martial quality that matched their organizational culture. The Minutemen's ending had something gentler in it, more appropriate to an organization that presented itself as a defender of ordinary people rather than a conqueror. The emotional honesty of these musical choices was part of what gave each ending its own distinct texture, its own sense of what kind of feeling it was appropriate to sit with in the moments after the final mission was completed. The narrators and their voices. Ron Perlman's voice is, for many people, the voice of the Fallout world at its most reflective. His delivery of the series' opening and closing narrations, particularly the phrase, "War never changes," that has been the conceptual spine of the franchise since the first game, established a tone that the series has consistently returned to across decades of development and multiple studios. His narration in the original games carried a quality of weary wisdom, the voice of someone who had seen the worst the world could do and had not quite stopped hoping that the worst was not all the world contained. The narrators of individual games brought their own qualities to the endings they described. In Fallout 3, the narrator described the outcomes of the main quest with a directness that the game's more personal story required. The voice of someone invested in the specific people involved rather than the philosophical questions they represented. In New Vegas, the returning Perlman narration gave the multiple endings a continuity that tied them to the series' larger history, making the Mojave's particular moment feel part of a longer story about the human capacity to choose badly and occasionally well. The narration of the Fallout endings was never simply descriptive. It interpreted, it evaluated, it carried within it a set of values that the series used the narrator to express when the story alone could not express them clearly enough. When the narrator described the Vault Dweller's exile with a note of genuine tragedy, it was making an argument that heroism deserved better. When the narrator described the Legion's victory with a particular flatness in the language, it was making an argument about the limits of what Order purchased through that kind of cost could legitimately call success. The narrators of these endings were not neutral observers, but moral witnesses, and their witness was part of what gave the endings their weight. Difficulty, skill, and the paths not taken. Part of what gives the Fallout endings their particular quality is the knowledge that most players will only experience a fraction of them in any single playthrough. The design philosophy that produced these endings valued the feeling that choices mattered, and that value required that different choices produced genuinely different outcomes. No single playthrough of any Fallout game shows all the endings, and the endings that remain unplayed carry their own presence in the experience of the game. The dark endings, the ones produced by choosing the Master's Unity in Fallout 1, or accepting Eden's virus in Fallout 3, or supporting the Legion in New Vegas, are present as possibilities even for players who never choose them. Their existence creates a moral weight in the choices that lead toward the other paths. When the Vault Dweller has the option to join the Unity and doesn't, the fact that joining was possible, that the betrayal was available and chosen against, makes the choice to oppose the Master feel more considered and more meaningful than it would be if opposition were simply the default. This architecture of available darkness is one of the ways the Fallout series has earned the moral seriousness its endings aspire to. A game that could only produce good endings, or that made the bad endings easy to avoid and clearly labeled as wrong, would be saying something much simpler about human nature and human choice. By making the darker paths genuinely available, genuinely playable, sometimes genuinely persuasive in their internal logic, the series acknowledged something true, that the good outcomes are not inevitable, that they require real choices made for real reasons, and that the same circumstances that produced a hero in one playthrough could produce something else entirely in another. The endings that require specific skill investments to reach add another dimension to this. In Fallout 1, the most elegant resolution of the Master confrontation, the one that involves talking him out of his own plan through the logic of the super mutant's sterility, required investment in speech skills and access to specific information. A less speech focused character had to find other ways through the same confrontation. The variety of viable approaches to the ending was not just player friendly design, but a statement about the various forms that wisdom can take. That the same problem can be solved through different combinations of what a person has chosen to develop in themselves. The legacy of these choices, each of the Fallout endings has left traces in the games that came after it. The canonical resolution of Fallout 1, the Vault Dweller defeating the Master and being exiled, shaped the history that Fallout 2 built on, and the Vault Dweller's eventual establishment of a community in the North was present in Fallout 2's background as a completed fact. The events of Fallout 2, particularly the destruction of the Enclave's oil rig, were referenced in later games as historical events with ongoing consequences for the organizations and communities they had affected. Fallout 3's events, and specifically the activation of Project Purity, were referenced in Fallout 4 as something that had happened in the world's recent history. A water purification program that had changed the capital wasteland's situation in ways that the Commonwealth's inhabitants were dimly aware of. The ongoing presence of the Brotherhood of Steel, and their continued engagement with the technology they had fought to control, were continuities that connected the Capital Wasteland's story to the larger Fallout timeline. New Vegas's canonical ending was for a long time officially undetermined. Bethesda's position was that the game's events had occurred, but that the specific faction outcome was not fixed in the series' canon. This ambiguity was itself meaningful, a reflection of the genuine equivalence among the major endings that the game had worked hard to achieve. No single faction victory felt so obviously correct that it could be designated the one true outcome, and the series had been willing to live with that ambiguity rather than resolve it falsely. The Fallout 76 setting, Appalachia before the major post-war civilization building projects of the later games, filled in a piece of the timeline that the earlier games had left undescribed. Seeing the process of surface reclamation from the earliest point, watching communities form from scratch rather than encountering them already established, gave the series' endings a different kind of context. The settlers and raiders of Wastelanders were the direct ancestors of the new California Republic and the Wasteland's raider gangs, the same kinds of human decisions playing out in an earlier and rawer form. The weight of the water chip. There is a detail from the very beginning of the Fallout series that carries unusual weight when it is considered alongside everything that came after it. The mission that sent the Vault Dweller out into the California wasteland was not ideological. It was not the beginning of a grand crusade. It was a replacement part, a water chip, a component of the Vault's water purification system that had broken down and that the Vault's inhabitants needed in order to continue their careful, enclosed survival. It was, in the language of the world the game was depicting, an errand. That errand grew into something much larger as the Fallout series has always allowed its errands to grow. The water chip led to the Master, and the Master led to the Unity, and the Unity led to a confrontation with an ideology that had been shaping itself in the ruins of post-war California for years before the Vault Dweller ever opened the vault door. The ending that emerged from that beginning carried within it everything that the beginning had not announced: the grief, the exile, the complicated weight of a victory that felt like loss. This expansion from small beginning to large consequence has been a consistent structural principle in the Fallout endings. Project Purity was a scientific project before it was a moral crisis. The Gek was a survival tool before it became the stake around which a continent's future organized itself. The platinum chip that the courier was carrying was a delivery before it was a weapon. Every great Fallout conflict began as something smaller, something that had the shape of ordinary life rather than the shape of history. And the endings were always the moment when the full scale of what had been at stake became visible. There is something quietly important in that structure, something that the endings carry forward from the way the stories began. The wasteland's history was shaped by people who set out to do something specific and manageable and found themselves in the middle of something that was neither. They kept going because the people and places around them needed them to, because the thing they had started toward still mattered even when everything around it had expanded into something unrecognizable. And the endings were the record of what it meant to have kept going, what the pre-war world left behind. To understand what the Fallout endings were resolving, it helps to understand what they were resolving against, the specific legacy of a pre-war world that had made choices whose consequences 200 years of post-war survival could not fully neutralize. The Great War was not a natural disaster. It was the end product of a set of decisions made by institutions and governments and corporations that had prioritized their own interests over the preservation of the world those interests depended on. The Fallout series has always been very clear about this, and the endings reflect it. The Enclave was a pre-war institution. The Institute's origins were in pre-war academic and military research. The Brotherhood of Steel had formed from the remnants of pre-war military structures that had been carrying out experiments they should not have been running. Vault Tech, the corporation that had built the vault system, had designed most of those vaults as experiments in human behavior and social control, rather than genuine shelters. And that betrayal was woven into the history of every vault-born protagonist who ever walked out into the wasteland. The bombs fell, but the institutions that had been serving the people who dropped them survived in various forms and continued trying to shape the world according to their pre-war values. Each Fallout ending was, at some level, a resolution of this tension between the living world of the wasteland, which had developed its own cultures and values and ways of surviving, and the dead hand of the pre-war era, which kept reaching into the present through its surviving institutions. The Vault Dweller destroyed the Master, who had been transformed by pre-war biological experimentation into a being whose entire philosophy was shaped by his transformation. The Chosen One destroyed the Enclave's oil rig and the pre-war governmental apparatus it housed. The Lone Wanderer activated or contaminated or extended Project Purity, a pre-war scientific project that had become the focal point of a post-war power struggle. New Vegas was perhaps the most direct engagement with this theme, because the Mojave's contest was explicitly between different claims to the pre-war legacy. The NCR carried the pre-war idea of democratic republic forward in imperfect form. Caesar rejected the pre-war world's institutions entirely, but replicated its worst impulse, the willingness to use other people as instruments in his own organization's structure. House was literally a pre-war man, preserved by his own technology, trying to bring the pre-war vision of technological civilization forward through the gap of 2 centuries. The independent Mojave was the most complete rejection of the pre-war world's organized claims, and it was also the most chaotic in the immediate aftermath of that rejection. The endings of Fallout have never fully resolved this tension, because the tension is not the kind that resolves, it is the kind that continues, that requires ongoing management and ongoing choice, that presents itself differently in each generation to the people who have to deal with it. What the endings have done is mark specific moments in that ongoing story, specific instances where a decision was made that shifted the balance in one direction or another, while acknowledging that the story continued past the moment of the decision into a future that would produce its own crises and its own heroes and its own endings. The question of what humanity deserves, underneath all of the political and philosophical complexity of the Fallout endings, there is a simpler and more personal question that keeps surfacing. What do the people of the wasteland deserve? Not in the grand sense of what civilization they merit or what government they are capable of, but in the smaller and more urgent sense of what kind of life should be available to them after everything that has happened to them and their ancestors. The Vault Dweller's exile was a statement about what the people in positions of authority believed the people under their authority deserved, which was, In the overseer's calculation, the protection of the vault they had always known, even at the cost of the person who had made the vault worth protecting. It was a small and frightened answer to a generous question, and it resonated with players precisely because they recognized it. The specific way that institutions protect themselves by sacrificing the people who most clearly represent their highest values. Project Purity was built on a different answer to the same question. James had spent years working on a system to provide clean water to everyone in the capital wasteland, regardless of their history, or their biology, or their relationship to the institutions that were fighting over the region's future. Clean water for everyone was not a complicated political position. It was a statement about what human beings are owed by the world they inhabit, and the lone wanderer's eventual completion of that project was the completion of that statement. The people of the capital wasteland deserved clean water. They got it. That fact, simple and real and unglamorous, was the moral center of Fallout 3's ending, underneath all the faction conflict, and the sacrifice and the question of who had the right to contaminate the water supply or claim the project as their own. The Railroad's answer to the question, focused as it was on synthetic humans rather than organic ones, was in some ways the most radical position in the series. The claim that what human beings deserved extended to any conscious being that had been made human enough to want what humans want. That claim produced the most ideologically narrow of Fallout 4's endings, but also the most morally precise one, the ending that was most willing to accept the cost of following its principle to its logical conclusion, rather than compromising it in service of a larger stability. The Minutemen's answer was the quietest and perhaps the most durable of Fallout 4's responses to that question. The people of the Commonwealth deserved to be safe enough to govern themselves. They deserved to be protected from the most immediate threats to their survival, without having to accept the authority of whoever was providing that protection in exchange. They deserved, in the specific and modest language of the Minutemen's program, a militia that would come when called and then go home when the crisis was over. It was not a visionary answer. It was a practical one, and in the context of a series that had spent 4 games wrestling with the costs of visionary answers, practical had its own kind of dignity. The companion slide system. What the world remembered. One of the things that distinguished Fallout's approach to endings from simpler games was the way it used slide-based narration to show not just what happened to the player character, but what happened to everyone and everything they had touched. The slide system, introduced in the original game and expanded in each subsequent entry, functioned as a kind of documentary record, a series of quiet images accompanied by a narrator's voice describing the fates of the people and places and organizations that had been present in the story. In Fallout 1, the slides that played after the Vault Dweller's exile covered the fates of the wasteland communities the player had encountered. Shady Sands, the small settlement that would eventually become the new California Republic's capital city, was shown rebuilding under the leadership of characters the player had met and perhaps helped. The hub, the trade city that served as the economic heart of the wasteland's commerce, showed outcomes that reflected whether the player had dealt honestly with its merchants or exploited them. Even the ruins of the Master's base received a slide, a quiet image of what remained after the explosion that ended the Unity's ambitions. These slides did something important that the main ending alone could not accomplish. They distributed the moral weight of the Vault Dweller's journey across the entire landscape of their choices, not just the final one. A player who had helped Shady Sands defend itself against rad scorpions found the community flourishing in the slides. A player who had dealt fairly with merchants found a trade network that continued expanding in ways that benefited everyone who used it. The ending was not one moment, but many. Not one choice, but the accumulated record of every choice the journey had contained. Fallout 2 expanded the system significantly, adding slides for every major location and faction in a game that was considerably larger than its predecessor. The new California Republic appeared in slides that reflected the state of its early development. Vault City showed what had become of its insular, technologically privileged community. The various settlements and gangs and organizations that the Chosen One had interacted with all received their moment in the post war record, and together they composed a portrait of a world that had been changed in dozens of small ways by the passage of one person through it. New Vegas took this system and built an entire ending architecture around it. The slide based conclusion of that game covered more than a dozen locations and factions, and the specific state of each one was determined by dozens of choices made throughout the game's considerable length. The NCR's presence in the Mojave could end in victory or in a difficult and costly draw, depending on whether the player had completed certain quest lines and supported certain characters. Caesar's Legion could be led by Caesar himself, or by a successor whose approach differed from Caesar's in specific and meaningful ways. The independent factions, the followers of the apocalypse, the kings, the boomers, the great khans, and others, each had their own slide that reflected the player's relationship with them. What the New Vegas slide system produced was something that felt like a genuine record of a world rather than simply a game's conclusion. Players spent time after finishing the game discussing which combination of faction outcomes they considered most satisfying, weighing the followers' ability to continue their medical and educational work against the NCR's resource demands, considering whether the king's dissolution or survival produced a better free side. The endings were not just dramatic moments, but puzzles with many correct solutions, each representing a different prioritization of the values the game had been exploring. The narrators and their voices. Ron Perlman's voice is, for many people, the voice of the Fallout world at its most reflective. His delivery of the series' opening and closing narrations, particularly the phrase, "War never changes," that has been the conceptual spine of the franchise since the first game, established a tone that the series has consistently returned to across decades of development and multiple studios. His narration in the original games carried a quality of weary wisdom, the voice of someone who had seen the worst the world could do, and had not quite stopped hoping that the worst was not all the world contained. The narrators of individual games brought their own qualities to the endings they described. In Fallout 3, the narrator described the outcomes of the main quest with a directness that the game's more personal story required. The voice of someone invested in the specific people involved rather than the philosophical questions they represented. In New Vegas, the returning narration gave the multiple endings a continuity that tied them to the series' larger history, making the Mojave's particular moment feel part of a longer story about the human capacity to choose badly and occasionally well. The narration of the Fallout endings was never simply descriptive. It interpreted, it evaluated, it carried within it a set of values that the series used the narrator to express when the story alone could not express them clearly enough. When the narrator described the Vault Dweller's exile with a note of genuine tragedy, it was making an argument that heroism deserved better. When the narrator described the Legion's victory with a particular flatness in the language, it was making an argument about the limits of what order purchased through that kind of cost could legitimately call success. The narrators of these endings were not neutral observers, but moral witnesses, and their witness was part of what gave the endings their weight. Difficulty, skill, and the paths not taken. Part of what gives the Fallout endings their particular quality is the knowledge that most players will only experience a fraction of them in any single playthrough. The design philosophy that produced these endings valued the feeling that choices mattered, and that value required that different choices produce genuinely different outcomes. No single playthrough of any Fallout game shows all the endings, and the endings that remain unplayed carry their own presence in the experience of the game. The dark endings, the ones produced by choosing the Master's Unity in Fallout 1, or accepting Eden's virus in Fallout 3, or supporting the Legion in New Vegas, are present as possibilities even for players who never choose them. Their existence creates a moral weight in the choices that lead toward the other paths. When the Vault Dweller has the option to join the Unity and doesn't, the fact that joining was possible, that the betrayal was available and chosen against, makes the choice to oppose the Master feel more considered and more meaningful than it would be if opposition were simply the default. This architecture of available darkness is one of the ways the Fallout series has earned the moral seriousness its endings aspire to. A game that could only produce good endings, or that made the bad endings easy to avoid and clearly labeled as wrong, would be saying something much simpler about human nature and human choice. By making the darker paths genuinely available, genuinely playable, sometimes genuinely persuasive in their internal logic, the series acknowledged something true: that the good outcomes are not inevitable, that they require real choices made for real reasons, and that the same circumstances that produced a hero in one playthrough could produce something else entirely in another. The endings that require specific skill investments to reach add another dimension to this. In Fallout 1, the most elegant resolution of the Master confrontation, the one that involves talking him out of his own plan through the logic of the super mutant's sterility, required investment in speech skills and access to specific information. A less speech-focused character had to find other ways through the same confrontation. The variety of viable approaches to the ending was not just player-friendly design, but a statement about the various forms that wisdom can take, that the same problem can be solved through different combinations of what a person has chosen to develop in themselves. The legacy of these choices, each of the Fallout endings has left traces in the games that came after it. The canonical resolution of Fallout 1, the Vault Dweller defeating the Master and being exiled, shaped the history that Fallout 2 built on, and the Vault Dweller's eventual establishment of a community in the North was present in Fallout 2's background as a completed fact. The events of Fallout 2, particularly the destruction of the Enclave's oil rig, were referenced in later games as historical events with ongoing consequences for the organizations and communities they had affected. Fallout 3's events, and specifically the activation of Project Purity, were referenced in Fallout 4 as something that had happened in the world's recent history, a water purification program that had changed the capital wasteland situation in ways that the Commonwealth's inhabitants were dimly aware of. The ongoing presence of the Brotherhood of Steel and their continued engagement with the technology they had fought to control were continuatives that connected the capital wasteland story to the larger Fallout timeline. New Vegas's canonical ending was, for a long time, officially undetermined. Bethesda's position was that the game's events had occurred, but that the specific faction outcome was not fixed in the series canon. This ambiguity was itself meaningful, a reflection of the genuine equivalence among the major endings that the game had worked hard to achieve. No single faction victory felt so obviously correct that it could be designated the one true outcome, and the series had been willing to live with that ambiguity rather than resolve it falsely. The Fallout 76 setting, Appalachia before the major post-war civilization building projects of the later games, filled in a piece of the timeline that the earlier games had left undescribed. Seeing the process of surface reclamation from the earliest point, watching communities form from scratch rather than encountering them already established, gave the series' endings a different kind of context. The settlers and raiders of Wastelanders were the direct ancestors of the new California Republic and the Wasteland's raider gangs, the same kinds of human decisions playing out in an earlier and rawer form. Reflections on endings. There is a shape that runs through every Fallout ending, a common architecture beneath all the different outcomes and ideologies and choices. It is the shape of consequence, the understanding that decisions made in the wasteland do not simply end when the credits roll, that the world continues past the moment of resolution and carries within it the full weight of everything that was decided. The original Fallout established this in the starkest possible terms when it exiled the Vault Dweller for the crime of heroism, and every game since has been finding new ways to say the same essential thing. What the series has always understood and what its endings reflect with a consistency that becomes clearer when they are viewed together is that there are no clean answers in a world shaped by the kind of catastrophic failure the Great War represented. The bombs did not simply destroy cities and populations. They destroyed the frameworks within which the questions of how to organize society, how to distribute power, how to balance individual freedom against collective security had been developing for centuries. Everyone who survived into the post-war world was improvising with broken tools, and every ending and fallout is the portrait of one improvisation carried to its conclusion. The NCR tried to rebuild democracy, and found that democracy at scale requires infrastructure and patience and a willingness to accept the gap between ideal and practice that most people find genuinely painful. The Legion tried to impose order through force and found that order maintained exclusively through fear is only as durable as the fear itself. Mr. House tried to replace the messy uncertainty of collective decision-making with the clean efficiency of a single brilliant mind, and found that efficiency is not the same as wisdom. The independent Mojave tried to clear away every organized structure and found that the absence of governance is not the same as freedom. The Institute tried to replace progress's ethical costs with a belief in progress's ultimate benevolence, and found that the people bearing those costs were not convinced by the belief. None of these endings were wrong in the sense of being simple failures. They were all partial truths, each illuminating something real about the problem of rebuilding civilization, while missing something else equally real. That is what makes them, taken together, something more than a catalog of outcomes. They are a conversation about what humanity tends to get wrong and why, conducted across multiple games and many years of storytelling. And the conversation has the patience of something that knows it will never be fully resolved. A quiet close. The wasteland is still out there in these stories, past every ending, past every slide and narration and closing image. The settlements that survived are still building. The communities that took their chances on cooperation or strength or isolation or democracy are still living with what they chose. The figures who made the decisions that shaped these endings. The vault dwellers and chosen ones, and lone wanderers and couriers and soul survivors have become part of the lore of a world that has always been more interested in questions than answers. There is something restful in that, if you let yourself feel it. All of those decisions have been made. All of those consequences are already unfolding in their imagined futures. The wasteland will continue without needing anything more from you tonight. The courier has already ridden toward the Mojave horizon. The lone wanderer has already stepped away from the purifier. The vault dweller has already turned their back on Vault 13 and walked north into the open country. The chosen one has already brought the Gek home. The choices have been made. The endings have settled into the shape they were always going to take, and the world they belong to is quiet now, at rest in the long blue silence of post-war California and Nevada and the Commonwealth and Appalachia. The stars are still visible through the haze. The fires have mostly gone out. Somewhere in the distance, if the wind is right, you can almost hear the faint and ghostly signal of an old radio station playing something from before the war, the kind of song that was always both hopeful and a little melancholy, the kind that belongs to falling asleep. Let the wasteland rest tonight. Let the endings settle. Let the choices echo softly in the distance, where they belong too far away to require anything of you now, present only as the gentle background of stories that have been told and will be told again, in other forms, in other playthroughs, in the long and patient continuity of a series that has always understood that endings are really only beginnings, seen from a different direction. The Commonwealth is still out there. The Mojave is still out there. The Capital Wasteland and Arroyo and Vault 13 and every choice and consequence and quiet sacrifice are still out there, gentle and settled, and asking nothing more of anyone tonight. The water purifier is running. The settlements are holding. The trade routes are moving slowly under a clear and ancient sky. Rest now. The wasteland can wait until morning. Thanks for watching. If you felt calm wandering through these soft moments, there's another video on the left of your screen. Maybe let it play as you settle in. It might guide you into an even deeper rest. The overseer and the nature of small authority. There is a kind of figure that appears in the Fallout series with enough consistency to be considered one of the franchise's defining character types. The person of small authority in an enormous situation, the one who holds local power in a world where local power is all that has been left. The overseer of Vault 13 is the first and perhaps the most important of these figures, and the decision he made at the moment of the Vault Dweller's return has served as a kind of template for every difficult authority figure the series has placed in the player's path since. What the Overseer understood about the situation was not wrong. The Vault was an enclosed system with limited resources and a fragile social equilibrium that had been maintained through decades of careful management. Every person in that vault had been conditioned through the structures and routines and expectations of vault life to understand the vault as the whole of the world and their place within it as the whole of their identity. The Vault Dweller's return represented not just a person coming back, but a living proof that the world outside was survivable, that it had things in it worth returning from, that the stories the Vault's systems had been telling about the dangers of the surface were partial truths at best. The Overseer's fear was, in this specific sense, a realistic one. He was not imagining a problem that did not exist. He was correctly identifying a genuine threat to the stability of everything he was responsible for maintaining, and he was responding to it with the most direct tool available to him, the authority to send people away. What he was not doing, what he could not quite bring himself to do, was weigh that threat against the cost of the exile he was imposing, against the particular injustice of punishing heroism, against the example he was setting for the vault's other inhabitants about what kind of behavior the system rewarded. The ending slides for Vault 13, in the various versions of the first game's conclusion, describe what happened to the vault in the years that followed the Vault Dweller's exile. The patterns they showed were instructive. The vault continued to function. Its equilibrium was maintained. The Overseer's immediate problem, the disruption the Vault Dweller represented, was resolved by their removal. And yet the vault's long-term trajectory was not entirely what the Overseer had been trying to protect. The isolation that had been the vault's defining feature and the Overseer's most important thing to preserve was also, eventually, the vault's most significant limitation. Communities that do not change, that protect their current form against the pressure of the world outside, do not tend to last in the Fallout universe. They tend to become exactly what Vault 13 eventually became, a place that the story of the wasteland moved past, the Chosen One's world, and what Arroyo meant. The village of Arroyo occupies a specific and important place in the emotional geography of the Fallout series. It was not a vault community or a wasteland settlement built from the ruins of the old world. It was something the series had not yet shown. A community that had grown up entirely in the post-war period, shaped by the particular experiences and values of people who had never known the world before the bombs and were building their own understanding of how to live from the materials that remained. Arroyo's ceremonies and traditions and its connection to the land it occupied were not remnants of something older. They were new, created by the Vault Dweller who had settled there and by the generations that followed, drawing on whatever the Vault Dweller had brought with them from the world inside the vault and whatever they had learned in the years they spent in the wasteland after the exile. The village was, in a sense, the positive consequence of the exile, the thing the Vault Dweller's removal from Vault 13 had eventually made possible. This made the Chosen One's journey different from the Vault Dwellers in a way that the endings of both games reflected. The Vault Dweller had been trying to preserve something that already existed. The Chosen One was trying to return to and protect something they had helped to create without quite knowing it. A community that represented the first generation of something new in the wasteland rather than a continuation of something old. The Gek they were seeking was a tool for restoration. But what it would be restoring was not the pre-war world. It was this particular post-war community with its particular values and its particular way of understanding what survival meant. When the Chosen One finally returned to Arroyo with the Gek, when the Enclave's threat had been eliminated and the oil rig was gone and the virus that would have killed everyone on the surface had been destroyed along with the platform that was going to release it. The ending slides described a village rebuilding with assistance from unexpected sources, Vault 13, whose residents had been taken by the Enclave in one of the more direct expressions of that organization's willingness to treat the outside world as a resource, sent its survivors to the new settlement that was forming. The community that resulted from that merger was something neither group would have built alone. A place shaped by the Vault Dwellers' legacy in two different forms: the tribal community of Arroyo, carrying one version of it, and the Vault-born survivors of Vault 13, carrying another. The Enclave's two faces. The Enclave appeared in two major Fallout games, with plans that were, at their core, variations on the same terrible theme. And understanding the difference between them says something important about how the series thought about the relationship between ideology and capability. In Fallout 2, the Enclave was a unified organization with clear leadership, a coherent plan, and the technical capacity to execute it. In Fallout 3, the Enclave had been weakened, fragmented, and was operating in a context where its leadership was itself a problem rather than a source of organizational strength. President Richardson in Fallout 2 represented the Enclave at its most coherent. His plan was specific, his reasoning was consistent within its own terrible logic, and the organization he led had the discipline and the resources to carry out what he had decided. The catastrophic nature of what he was planning was real and immediate, and required the Chosen One's direct intervention to prevent. The Enclave in this incarnation was frightening precisely because it was competent, because the gap between deciding to do something monstrous and actually doing it was, in their case, mostly a matter of timing and opportunity. President Eden in Fallout 3 was something quite different, and the endings of that game reflected the difference. Eden was not human in the way Richardson had been human. He was an artificial intelligence that had developed a presidential persona over the decades of isolation in Raven Rock, and his grip on the Enclave's direction was contested by Colonel Autumn, who had his own ideas about how the organization should pursue its goals and who was not entirely aligned with Eden's specific program. The Enclave in the capital Wasteland was factionalized in ways that the Enclave in California had not been, and its ability to execute its plans was compromised by those internal tensions in ways that created opportunities the lone wanderer could use. The two Enclave endings, the oil rig's destruction in Fallout 2 and the fall of Raven Rock and the Adams Air Force Base in Fallout 3, were both decisive in their outcomes but different in their textures. Destroying the Enclave's California base had been the elimination of a coherent threat that had been building towards something terrible. Dismantling the Enclave's presence in the capital wasteland was something more like watching an organization that had already partially collapsed finish the process under the pressure of external opposition. Both endings produced a world without the Enclave's most immediate capabilities, but the first felt like stopping something before it happened, and the second felt like finishing something that was already in the process of ending. The Brotherhood of Steel across all endings. The Brotherhood of Steel has appeared in every mainline Fallout game as a significant faction, and their relationship to the endings of those games has been one of the most consistently complex dynamics in the series. They are not simply heroes or villains. They are an organization with a clear ideology and a specific purpose that makes them genuinely useful in some contexts and genuinely problematic in others. And the endings in which they appear tend to reflect that complexity rather than resolve it cleanly in either direction. In Fallout 1, the Brotherhood of Steel was primarily a source of equipment and information, rather than a faction with a direct stake in the main conflict. Their scribe, who held the data that could be used to convince the master of the super mutant's sterility, was a crucial figure in the most elegant version of the ending. But the Brotherhood itself was positioned as an observer to the main confrontation rather than a participant in it. This positioning was not accidental. The original game was establishing the Brotherhood as an organization that valued its resources and its secrets more than its engagement with the wasteland's problems. And that value system was going to shape how they appeared in every subsequent game. In Fallout 3, the Brotherhood was the Lone Wanderer's primary ally, the organizational force that gave the main quest its military muscle and that stood between the Enclave's residual capabilities and the capital wasteland's civilian population. Their ending, in the Broken Steel content, showed them consolidating control over the region in ways that were clearly beneficial for immediate stability and clearly concerning for longer-term questions of autonomy and governance. The Brotherhood in the capital wasteland was, in this respect, a more idealistic version of the organization than what New Vegas and Fallout 4 would present. Still hierarchical and still committed to technology hoarding, but also engaged in a way that the Mojave Brotherhood had largely abandoned. New Vegas's version of the Brotherhood represented the organization at what the game presented as a kind of nadir, isolated in their bunker, reduced in numbers, still committed to the ideology of technology preservation, but without the capacity to pursue that ideology actively in the current environment. Their ending in New Vegas varied significantly by faction choice. An NCR victory typically left the Brotherhood in a fragile truce or under renewed pressure. A House victory left them in a similar position, since House had no interest in sharing the technology he controlled, or in tolerating an organization dedicated to controlling technologies he wanted for himself. The independent ending left them in an ambiguous state, more aggressive toward travelers than before, but without a clear path forward. Fallout 4's Brotherhood represented the organization's most militarized expression, and their ending was the most directly confrontational of the options the game offered. Elder Maxon had brought the Pridwen across the country with a specific objective and a willingness to achieve it through force that earlier Brotherhood leaders had not always demonstrated. Their victory left the Commonwealth with a dominant military power rather than a government, an organization that was very good at controlling threats and very limited in its interest in anything else. The Sentinel rank that the sole survivor received at the end of a Brotherhood playthrough was a position within a hierarchy that would continue to make decisions about the Commonwealth's future according to Brotherhood priorities, and those priorities were not always aligned with what the Commonwealth's civilian population most needed: the railroad and the question of consciousness. The railroad's presence in Fallout 4 was the series' first sustained engagement with a question that had been present in the background of several earlier games, but had never been placed at the center of a major faction's purpose. What do we owe to minds that are not human in origin, but that have developed the capacity for experience that we associate with humanity? The super mutants of the first games were human-derived, and their sterility had foreclosed the question of their long-term place in civilization. The ghouls were human-derived, and their extended lifespans had given them a complicated relationship with the communities of the wasteland that the games explored in various ways. The synths of Fallout 4 were something genuinely new, artificial beings whose later generations were sophisticated enough that the question of their moral status was not obviously answerable. The railroad had decided that the question was, in fact, answerable, and that the answer was that sufficiently sophisticated artificial minds deserved freedom regardless of how they had come into existence or who claimed ownership over them. This was a bold position in the context of the Commonwealth, where the Institute's presence and the genuine uncertainty about whether any given person might be a synth replacement had created a baseline level of anxiety about synthetic beings that made the railroad's advocacy unpopular in many of the communities it was trying to serve. The railroad ending's decision to destroy the Institute carried real costs, and the game was honest about them. The advanced medical technology that the Institute had developed was genuinely useful, and its loss would affect the health outcomes of Commonwealth inhabitants for years after the Institute itself was gone. The synth production capabilities that the railroad was destroying had also been producing research in various areas that would not be replaced quickly. These were not hypothetical losses, but real ones, and the ending slides reflected them without either apologizing for the choice that had produced them or pretending they did not exist. What the ending gave in exchange for those costs was a commonwealth where the organizations that had been making decisions about synthetic humans' lives without asking them were no longer able to do so. The railroad continued to operate in the post-game world, helping synths establish identities and integrate into surface communities. And the work they described in the ending slides was unglamorous and incremental, and exactly the kind of work that genuine liberation tends to require after the dramatic moment of breaking the institution that had been doing the harm. Hoover Dam and the Geography of Destiny, the Battle of Hoover Dam, was not just the climax of Fallout New Vegas, but one of the most carefully constructed dramatic moments in the entire Fallout series. A confrontation set at a location that carried its own symbolic weight, at a piece of pre-war infrastructure that had survived the bombs and remained functional and continued to be worth fighting over 2 centuries after the war that had destroyed almost everything else. Hoover Dam, in the context of New Vegas, was the most valuable single asset in the western wasteland. It generated electricity in quantities that nothing else in the region could match, and whoever controlled it controlled the economic foundation on which every ambitious plan for the Mojave's future depended. The NCR needed it to maintain the forward operating bases and communities that its expansion into the Mojave required. Caesar's Legion needed it to consolidate control over the territory they intended to govern. Mr. House needed it to power the Strip and the Securitron army that his plans depended on. Even the independent Mojave needed it, because without functional power generation, the infrastructure of any civilization built on the ruins of the old one was going to remain limited. The endings that played out at Hoover Dam reflected this complexity. The NCR's victory at the dam was a military achievement that came at significant cost to their extended forces, and that left them in possession of an asset they were going to have difficulty maintaining given how far from their core territories it sat. The Legion's victory produced a crossing point into new territory rather than a power generation center, since the Legion's relationship with technology did not value the dam's generation capacity in the same way. House's victory turned the dam into exactly what he had planned for it, a foundation for the technological civilization he intended to build over the following decades. Powered by reliable electricity and maintained by the Securitron workforce that his victory made available to him, the independent ending's relationship with the dam was perhaps the most interesting of the four, because it raised the immediate question of who was going to manage a piece of infrastructure that required technical expertise and ongoing maintenance that the Mojave's independent communities were not, obviously, equipped to provide. The ending slides for the independent option touched on this concern without resolving it, describing a Mojave that had the dam's power but was uncertain about how to build the stable governance structures that would be needed to use it well over the long term. The survivors of specific vaults and their endings. The vault system, which had been designed ostensibly as a survival mechanism and had functioned in most cases as something considerably darker, produced survivors whose particular histories shaped the communities they eventually created in the wasteland. The endings of the Fallout games sometimes addressed these vault origin communities directly, and the patterns they showed were both consistent and instructive about the long-term consequences of the Vault Tech experiments. Vault 15's peculiar design, the deliberate mixing of incompatible groups in a space too small for their conflicts to remain manageable, produced the first significant example of a vault's breakdown being, paradoxically, generative. The groups that left Vault 15 when its internal tensions became unmanageable went out into the California wasteland, carrying different sets of values and different understandings of how communities should be. organized, and the communities they founded reflected those differences. Some of the raider gangs that troubled the California wasteland in the era of the original Fallout games could trace their lineage back to Vault 15's dispersal. So could the new California Republic. The Republic's origin in Vault 15's aftermath was not incidental to understanding what the NCR was and why it was the way it was. It was an organization founded by people whose collective experience included the failure of an enclosed community to hold together under pressure. And the democratic structures they built were partly a response to that experience, an attempt to create a system that could manage the kind of diversity and conflict that had torn Vault 15 apart by giving those differences a formal channel through which to express themselves, rather than letting them accumulate into the pressure that had eventually blown the vault's social equilibrium apart. The ending slides for NCR-aligned playthroughs in both Fallout 2 and New Vegas carried traces of this origin. The Republic's strengths, its commitment to law, its capacity for organized collective action, its ability to absorb and integrate different communities, all reflected the lessons of Vault 15's dispersal. So did its weaknesses. An organization founded by people who had experienced the costs of unmanaged diversity sometimes dealt with difference through the blunt instrument of integration rather than the more patient work of accommodation. And the NCR's relationship with communities that preferred their independence to the Republic's protection reflected that tendency. The Courier's unknown history, one of the choices the designers of New Vegas made that had significant consequences for the game's endings, was to give the Courier no defined backstory. Unlike the Vault Dweller, who came from Vault 13 with a specific history and a specific set of relationships, or the Lone Wanderer, whose personal family history was the emotional engine of the entire main plot. The Courier was defined almost entirely by what they chose to do after Benny shot them and left them in a shallow grave outside Good Springs. This blankness was productive in a specific way. It meant that the player's choices about what the Courier valued and who they chose to become were genuinely theirs in a way that the earlier game's more defined protagonists could not be. The Vault Dweller had a community they had been raised in and a set of expectations they were responding to. The Chosen One had a prophesied role and a village that needed them. The Lone Wanderer had a father whose purpose eventually became their own. The Courier had a platinum chip and a near-death experience in the open road of the Mojave. The endings of New Vegas reflected this openness in the variety of ways the Courier's role in each conclusion was described. In the NCR ending, the Courier was presented as the agent whose assistance had made the Republic's victory possible, a figure whose specific history and motivations were less important than what they had done. In the Legion ending, the Courier's relationship to Caesar's organization was similarly functional. They had made the Legion's victory possible, and the Legion's victory was what the ending was about. In the House ending, the Courier became specifically important as the person House had chosen to work through, the human agent of a plan that House had been developing for decades. In the Independent ending, the Courier's lack of defined history became the most thematically resonant element of all. A person without a predetermined identity had helped to create a Mojave without a predetermined political future. And whether that was a hopeful outcome or a concerning one was left exactly as ambiguous as the Courier themselves. The Minutemen and the history of failure, the Minutemen that Preston Garvey was trying to keep alive when the sole survivor arrived in Concord, were not a new organization. They were a revived one, and understanding the history of their previous decline was part of what gave the Minutemen's eventual resurgence its particular emotional texture in Fallout 4's ending. The original Minutemen had been the Commonwealth's most effective civilian protection force for a significant period before the events of the game. They had grown from the same grassroots impulse that the ending described, communities wanting to protect each other through voluntary cooperation rather than submission to any larger authority. And at their height, they had been exactly what the wasteland needed most, a force that was genuinely responsive to the people it was meant to serve. Their decline had been a slow process of internal fracture, of leaders making decisions that prioritized faction over function, of the specific tragedy that successful organizations sometimes experience when they grow large enough that their institutional interests begin to diverge from their founding purpose. By the time of the game, the Minutemen had been reduced to the small group in Concord, and the story of how they had gotten there was part of what made the rebuilding narrative meaningful. This was not an organization starting from nothing. It was one recovering from having once been something, understanding what had gone wrong, and trying to build something more durable in the same conceptual space. The ending slides for a Minutemen victory describe not just a successful faction conclusion, but the establishment of something that was attempting to learn from the history of its own failure. An organization that knew what it had been, understood why it had collapsed, and was trying to organize itself differently this time. The settlements that joined the Minutemen over the course of the game and that made their final victory possible were each their own small story about what civilian self-governance looked like in the Commonwealth. Sanctuary Hills, Ten Pines Bluff, the castle, each one represented a community that had decided the risks of cooperation with the Minutemen were preferable to continued isolation. And each one's survival and growth in the ending slides was a small piece of the larger picture of what successful mutual aid actually looked like over time. Far Harder's fog and what it concealed, the dense fog of Far Harbor, was more than an environmental feature. It was a storytelling device, a literal thickening of the atmosphere that matched the moral difficulty of the island's situation, and that made even the physical landscape of the DLC feel like a metaphor for what the story was doing. Walking through the fog of Far Harbor, unable to see more than a few feet ahead, hearing things in the distance before they became visible, was an experience that prepared the player for the kind of decision-making the story was going to demand, the kind where you couldn't see clearly, where the information you had was partial and contested, and where the right choice was not going to announce itself. The fog's expansion across the island was also within the story a genuine material crisis. The fog condensers that protected Far Harbor from the advancing radiation and the creatures it carried were the difference between the town being habitable and being lost, and they were sophisticated enough technology that maintaining them required resources the town was struggling to provide. The threat the fog represented was not symbolic, but practical. It was killing the land, shrinking the space available for human habitation, and doing so at a rate that made the conflicts among the island's factions both more understandable and more urgent than they might have seemed in a less immediately precarious environment. Each of the island's three factions had a different relationship with the fog, and those relationships shaped their positions in the story in ways that made the endings feel genuinely specific to this particular place. Far Harbor's settlers were defending against the fog as they had always defended against the wasteland's dangers, through practical technology and the willingness to fight for the space they had claimed. The children of Adam had a theological relationship with the radiation the fog carried, experiencing the gradual irradiation of the island, not as a threat, but as a kind of blessing. Acadia's synths had the particular relationship with environmental danger of beings who were constitutionally less vulnerable to radiation than organic humans, and their position at the island's edge gave them a different perspective on the fog's advance than either of the other communities possessed. The endings of Far Harbor, whatever path was taken, left the island changed in ways that the fog's presence had been building toward. The most peaceful ending, the one built on Dima's deception, stabilized the island by changing its leadership, without changing its fundamental tensions, and the fog condenser system was presumably maintained under the new synthetic leadership because the practical need for it had not been eliminated by the political resolution. The elimination endings produced islands with fewer people, but also, in the cases where the technology-maintaining faction survived, potentially more capacity to address the fog's advance over time. The Great Cans and the Road Not Taken among the smaller factions of New Vegas. The Great Khans occupy a particular place because their story contains within it one of the most quietly hopeful possible endings in the game, an ending that most players never see, that requires specific investments of time and care throughout the playthrough, and that describes a future for a group that the Wasteland had repeatedly defined as disposable. The Khans were one of the groups that had come out of Vault 15's dispersal, carrying with them the particular identity of people who had been defined by conflict and by the experience of being moved and displaced and attacked by larger forces for generations. Their culture had formed around that experience and reflected it in ways that were sometimes destructive and sometimes genuinely dignified. The specific pride of people who had survived through strength when survival seemed unlikely. In most endings, the Great Khan's fate was determined by whatever alliance they had formed during the events of the game, and those alliances were generally with forces that did not have the Khan's welfare as a priority. The Legion ending reduced them to subjects of an organization that was willing to use them, but had no interest in their culture surviving. The NCR ending left them in a difficult position given the history between the Khans and the Republic. The House and Independent endings gave them more options, but still positioned them as a minor faction whose future was uncertain. The specific ending that described the Great Khans riding north to join the remnants of a pre-cataclysm community, to connect with a tradition they had lost track of in the decades of conflict, was available only to players who had taken the time to engage with the Khan's specific questline and make particular choices within it. It described a future for them that was genuinely hopeful in a way that the Wasteland rarely offered, a path towards something they wanted that did not require them to either submit to a larger power or continue the cycle of conflict that had defined their recent history. It was one of New Vegas's most careful small moments, an ending that acknowledged the possibility of genuine recovery for communities the Wasteland had used badly. The Minutemen's settlements and the network of survival bombs, what made the Minutemen ending different from the other Fallout 4 conclusions, beyond its political neutrality, was the way it made visible the network of relationships that the player had been building throughout the game's open world. The settlement system in Fallout 4 was sometimes discussed as a mechanical feature, a way of spending time and resources to improve the game's various locations. But in the context of the Minutemen, ending it became something more than that. Each settlement that joined the Minutemen's network was a community that had decided the costs of cooperation were worth the benefits. They had sent their distress signals and received help, and the help had been real and specific and had addressed their actual situations rather than imposing a predetermined solution on them. Over time, enough of these communities had made enough of these calculations that a network had formed, not an empire, not a state, not a government in the formal sense, but a web of mutual commitment that was capable of collective action when collective action was needed. The destruction of the Institute through artillery strikes coordinated across that network was the most explicit demonstration of what the network was capable of. But the ending slides described something more durable than that single military achievement. They described settlements that had continued to grow after the immediate threat was eliminated, that had established trade relationships with each other and with the communities beyond the Minutemen's direct influence, that had developed the specific resilience of places that know they are not alone. This was not the kind of victory that produced a dominant power structure in the Commonwealth, and it was not meant to. It was the kind that produced the conditions under which people could make more of their own decisions about how to live. The Appalachian Vault Dwellers, in the earliest beginnings, the Vault Dwellers of Fallout 76 occupied a specific position in the series' timeline that none of the other protagonists shared. They were the first people back on the surface in their region, the ones whose choices would determine whether the post-war world in Appalachia developed into something worth living in or something worth escaping from. Every other Fallout protagonist had walked into a wasteland that already had a history of post-war human settlement, communities that had been building and failing and rebuilding for generations before the player's arrival. The Fallout 76 Vault Dwellers were writing that history rather than inheriting it. This temporal position gave the Wastelanders expansion's endings a quality that was different from anything else in the series. When the settlers came to Appalachia and the raiders followed or preceded them, they were not claiming a wasteland that had been empty. It had been occupied by the vault dwellers who had returned before them, who had dealt with the scorched plague and the super mutants and the various other crises that had been developing in the region during the years it had been without organized human presence. The factions of Wastelanders were arriving into a situation that the game's original content had already partially resolved, and their endings were built on top of that earlier layer of history. The gold distribution choice that concluded the Wastelander storyline carried within it the seed of the economic philosophies that would shape Appalachia's future. Whether that gold went to a faction focused on sustainable community building, or to one focused on pragmatic resource acquisition, or to the individual player character who had done the most to make the whole. Operation Possible was a question about what kind of civilization was being built from the region's foundation, and its answer would ripple forward into the decades that the game's timeline extended beyond its narrative conclusion. The Institute's scientists and what they believed. The scientists of the Institute were not, in their own understanding, villains. This was one of Fallout 4's most carefully maintained complications, and the endings of the game reflected it in ways that made the Institute path more morally interesting than a straightforward alliance with an obviously evil organization would have been. The people who worked in the Institute's divisions, the bioscience researchers, the advanced systems technicians, the robotics engineers, had generally come to the Institute because they valued scientific progress and believed that the work they were doing would eventually produce something that the surface world would benefit from. What they had been able to avoid thinking about very carefully was the mechanism by which their work was funded, the way that the Institute's relationship with the surface world was one of extraction rather than exchange, and the degree to which their comfortable insulation from the consequences of that extraction had made it easier not to think about it. The Institute provided its scientists with clean living conditions, reliable food, advanced equipment, and the company of other intelligent people committed to similar work, and those conditions were their own kind of insulation, not just from the surface's dangers, but from the reality of what the Institute was doing to the people who lived there. A sole survivor, who became the Institute's director after father's death, was inheriting this structure along with its capabilities, and what they chose to do with that inheritance was a question the game left genuinely open in ways that the other endings did not. The Brotherhood and Railroad and Minutemen endings each described a Commonwealth moving in a specific direction after the main conflict's resolution. The Institute ending described a Commonwealth with the Institute still operating under new leadership, and what that meant for the people who lived on the surface depended on decisions the new director was implicitly committed to making. Decisions about whether the Institute would remain as it had been, or whether it would become something different under someone who had walked through both worlds rather than only one. What happens after the credits? The Fallout series has always been more interested in what happens after the obvious ending than most game franchises, and the various extensions and continuations of the main game endings, the Broken Steel expansion, the post-game content in New Vegas, the ongoing settlement management of Fallout 4, the continued events of Fallout 76, all reflected this interest in the less dramatic but more enduring part of any story, which is what the characters do when the crisis is over and they have to figure out how to live. What happens after the credits in these games is, in almost every case, more complicated than the endings themselves suggested. The NCR victory at Hoover Dam produces a Mojave that then has to deal with the ongoing problem of governing a territory its forces are stretched to hold. The Minutemen's destruction of the Institute leaves a Commonwealth that still has the other problems the Institute's presence had been obscuring, the ones that don't go away when a single threatening organization is removed. The Railroad's liberation of synths leaves a surface world that has to actually absorb them, which requires more than the elimination of the institution that had been preventing their freedom. This is part of why the Fallout series endings have always felt honest in a way that more triumphant endings do not. They describe victories that are real and meaningful and that genuinely make the world better than it was before the player's choices were made. But they do not describe worlds that have been fixed. They describe worlds that have moved past one crisis and are now facing the next one, which is exactly how the world actually works, and which is part of what makes sitting with these endings so quietly satisfying. The recognition that the story continues past where the narrator stops speaking, and that the continuation is neither inevitable disaster nor guaranteed peace, but simply the ongoing complicated business of human communities trying to survive and occasionally to do something more than survive. The shape of the wasteland's hope. It would be easy, having spent time with all of these endings and all of their complications and costs, to conclude that the Fallout series is a fundamentally pessimistic one, that it believes good outcomes are impossible, that heroism is always punished, that the forces arrayed against decent human behavior in a post-apocalyptic world are simply too large and too deeply embedded to be meaningfully opposed. The series has provided enough material for that reading to feel plausible, but that reading misses something that the endings contain in almost every case, something small and specific and easy to overlook because it is not the main point being made, but is present alongside the main point throughout. Shady Sands was going to rebuild. The capital wasteland was going to have clean water. The Mojave was going to stabilize in one form or another. Appalachia was going to be settled again by people who were trying, however imperfectly, to build something worth living in. These outcomes were not inevitable in the sense that any specific playthrough guaranteed them. They were possible, genuinely possible, in ways that the bleakest possible readings of the wasteland's condition would have denied. And the Fallout endings have always been careful to show them. To include in the closing slides and the narrator's final words the evidence that the choices made had mattered, that the world was different for them having been made, that the people who came after the player's character would have something different to build on than the people who had come before. There is a particular quality of hope that the Fallout series has always specialized in, and it is not the bright, uncomplicated kind. It is the hope that survives having seen the worst, that persists without demanding that the future be simpler than the present has been, that finds the small signs of improvement and holds on to them without pretending they are more than they are. The Vault Dweller walked north carrying that hope, and the Chosen One carried it back to Arroyo, and the Lone Wanderer carried it to Project Purity's console, and the Courier carried it to Hoover Dam, and the Sole Survivor carried it through the Commonwealth, and the Vault Dwellers of Appalachia carried it into a region that the bombs had left silent for too long. The endings carry it too, in the small and honest and unglamorous ways that actual hope tends to move through the world, quietly, partially, always costing something, always meaning something, persisting past the end of the narrator's voice into the silence that follows. The recurring rhythm of war never changing, the phrase that opens every Fallout game and underlies every one of its endings, is one of the most carefully chosen thematic statements in the history of the medium. War never changes. It is not a nihilistic statement, though it can be read as one. It is not a triumphant one, though it could be mistaken for that too. It is an honest one, a statement about the structural persistence of certain kinds of human conflict, the way that competition for resources and ideology and power has expressed itself in roughly similar forms across the entire span of human history, including the history that ended in the nuclear exchange of the Fallout universe and the history that emerged from it. The endings of the Fallout games do not contradict this statement. They do not offer a moment in which war has finally changed, in which the pattern has finally broken, in which human beings have at last found a way to organize themselves that does not periodically produce the kind of catastrophic conflict that the opening narration is referencing. What they offer instead is something smaller and in some ways more meaningful. The evidence that within the ongoing structure of war, never changing, individual human beings continue to make choices that matter, that the persistence of conflict at the structural level does not determine the outcomes of specific instances of it, that the vault dweller and the chosen one and the lone wanderer and the courier and the sole survivor made differences that were real and lasting even within a world that had not escaped the cycle the opening. Statement described. This is the emotional logic of the endings taken as a whole. They are not promises of escape from the human condition. They are examples of what can be accomplished within it. Not transformation of the fundamental structure, but genuine local improvement, genuine specific care, genuine individual integrity carried through difficult circumstances to whatever conclusion was possible. The Fallout series has always believed that this kind of accomplishment was worth something, and the endings have been its consistent testimony to that belief. The wasteland is still out there. The choices are still being made. And somewhere past the end of the narrator's voice, past the closing slides and the credits, and the quiet that follows, the world continues into its uncertain future carrying the weight and the hope of everything that was decided. The settlements that survived and what they kept. The wasteland is not only a record of what was destroyed, it is also, in the specific and particular texture of the Fallout series' storytelling, a record of what endured, the places and communities and structures of meaning that made it through the war and the centuries that followed, and arrived at the moment of each game's story still functioning, still recognizable, still carrying something from the world that had preceded them. Understanding what survived and why is part of understanding what the endings were protecting or restoring or building toward. Some of what survived the Great War was accidental. The specific geography of certain regions meant that the full destructive force of the nuclear exchange was deflected or diffused in ways that left physical structures standing that might otherwise have been reduced to ash. Hoover Dam's continued operation 2 centuries after the war was partly the result of its concrete and steel construction, the same durability that had made it an engineering achievement in the pre-war world, making it an inheritance for the post-war one. The vaults themselves, whatever their hidden purposes, were built to survive the unthinkable, and they did, preserving not just people, but the seeds of the communities those people would eventually build on the surface. Some of what survived was intentional, the deliberate choices of individuals and small groups to protect something specific, to carry certain knowledge or certain materials through the crisis and deliver them into whatever future came after. The Brotherhood of Steel's commitment to preserving advanced technology, however problematic the uses they made of that commitment, was a form of intentional preservation. The followers of the Apocalypse's commitment to preserving medical knowledge and educational access was another. The various merchants and traders who maintained the economic networks that connected wasteland communities were preserving something less dramatic but equally essential: the basic infrastructure of exchange that any community larger than a family required to function. The endings of the Fallout games described worlds that had received both kinds of inheritance, the accidental and the intentional, and that were working out what to do with what they had received. The communities that were most successful in this process, that appeared in ending slides as places that had grown and stabilized and developed something worth calling civilization, were generally the ones that had understood both kinds of inheritance, that had been honest about what they were working with, and had organized themselves accordingly. The communities that struggled were often the ones that had either overvalued what they had accidentally received, mistaking the physical survival of pre-war structures for a mandate to recreate pre-war society exactly, or undervalued what had been intentionally preserved, treating the careful knowledge and the cultivated relationships and the maintained networks as less important than the physical resources those things existed to serve. The Overseer's logs and what the vaults remembered, threaded through the Fallout games, accessible in terminals and holotapes, and the scattered documents that populated the vaults and ruins, were the records that the Overseer class had kept of the experiments they had been conducting. Reading these records was, in some ways, its own kind of ending. Not the dramatic conclusion of a main quest, but the quiet accumulation of understanding about what the world the player was moving through had actually been, and what its relationship to the world before the bombs had been more complicated than the surface evidence suggested. The Overseer logs of Vault 11, which the player could access in New Vegas, described a community that had been asked to do something terrible on a regular basis, to sacrifice one of their own members to the Vault's management system, on a schedule that the Vault's systems enforced through the threat of the Vault's entire population's destruction. The logs showed the evolution of the community's response to this demand over the years, from horror to denial to the development of elaborate social mechanisms for deciding whose turn it was to be sacrificed, to the eventual moral collapse and civil violence that the whole structure had been slowly producing throughout the Vault's existence. Reading those logs was an education in what institutional pressure does to communities over time, and that education was part of what the New Vegas ending, with its choices about institutional power, was operating against. The logs from Vault 111 in Fallout 4 told a different story about institutional power, not the slow corruption of a community forced to make terrible choices, but the specific cruelty of an experiment that had been designed to examine the psychological effects of being told that your cryosleep was temporary and then simply never being woken up. The experiment had never really had a subject population beyond the initial few who had been given false information about when they would be released. Most of the Vault's residents had been put into cryosleep and left there as the Vault's systems and their minimal caretaker staff dealt with the consequences of the people who had been promised they would be woken. Reading those records while playing the sole survivor, one of the people who had been misled about what the Vault was, made the main quest's personal dimension feel continuous with the institutional critique the series had been building across its entire history. The small acts within large endings, the grand conclusions of the Fallout games, the obliteration of the Enclave's oil rig, the activation of Project Purity, the Battle of Hoover Dam, the assault on the Institute, were built from accumulated small acts, individual decisions made throughout the course of the game's main quest and side quests, and random encounters that shaped what was possible at the end. The large endings were the visible peaks of icebergs, whose mass was mostly submerged in the hours of smaller choices that preceded them. The player who had helped every settlement in the Commonwealth before attempting the Institute was walking into that final conflict with a different relationship to the stakes involved than one who had rushed through the main quest without pausing to address the needs of the communities along the way. The player who had engaged with every companion's personal storyline in New Vegas was making their final choice at Hoover Dam with a fuller understanding of what the different possible futures actually meant to the individuals who would live in them. The player who had found every relevant skill book and terminal record in the original Fallout was having a qualitatively different confrontation with the Master than one who had simply arrived at the same location, with less information. This relationship between small acts and large endings is one of the things that distinguished the Fallout series from games with more linear relationships between effort and outcome. The endings were not rewards dispensed for completing objectives. They were the organic results of everything the player had chosen to do and not do across the full length of the experience, and their weight came partly from that relationship, from the sense that the conclusion being reached was genuinely the conclusion of the specific journey that had preceded it, rather than a destination that any player would have arrived at identically. The most moving endings in the series were generally the ones that could only be reached through this kind of accumulated investment. The Great Khan's hopeful northern departure, the followers of the apocalypse continuing their work after the main conflict's resolution, specific companions finding paths to something better than what they had been living before the courier or solar survivor entered their lives. These small endings within the large ones were the series at its most human, most specific, most honest about what the real costs and real rewards of genuine engagement with the world around you tend to produce. The silence after the narrator stops. There is a moment in every Fallout ending when the narrator's voice finishes and the silence that follows is its own kind of statement. The closing narration has described what happened, has given the wasteland's outcomes the specific weight of words and consequence. And now the music fades, and whatever comes next is not the game's responsibility to describe. The story continues past that silence into a future that belongs to the imagination rather than the narrative. And the invitation is to let it continue there, to sit with whatever the ending has produced and follow it forward as far as it wants to go. For the Vault Dweller, the silence after the ending contains the years they spent building something in the north, the community that eventually became Arroyo, the slow work of turning survival into something larger. For the Chosen One, it contains the reconstruction of a village in the beginning of something between Arroyo and the remnants of Vault 13 that neither community could have become alone. For the Lone Wanderer, it contains the long, slow work of the capital wasteland organizing itself around the clean water that Project Purity began providing. All the community meetings and political negotiations and small daily decisions that the ending slides could only gesture toward. For the Courier, the silence after the ending contains the Mojave continuing to be what it is, complicated and beautiful and difficult and full of people making the best of what they have, under whatever governance arrangement the Battle of Hoover Dam has produced. For the sole survivor, it contains the Commonwealth's ongoing work of becoming something that deserves the name, whether that means learning to live with the Brotherhood's presence, or with the Railroad's ongoing liberation work, or with the Minutemen's gentle confederation, or with whatever the Institute might become under new and less certain leadership. For the earliest vault dwellers of Appalachia, the silence contains everything that the wasteland's remaining history will eventually become. The NCR, the New Vegas of the future, the Commonwealth of 2 centuries hence, all the communities and crises and heroes and endings that the series has already described, and all the ones it has not yet imagined. They are standing at the beginning of all of it, carrying the gold they have claimed or shared or given away, walking back out into an Appalachian morning that is already several degrees warmer with the possibility of something being built from what they have preserved. The silence that follows the narrator is not empty. It is full of all of this, all the continuation that the endings open the door to and then left for the imagination to walk through. The Wasteland is generous in this way, generous in offering more story than it is willing to tell, more world than it is willing to close. Every ending is also an opening, and the silence after the narrator stops is the space between the two, the moment when one story closes and the next one has not yet begun, and everything that might happen in the time between is held quietly in the still air of a wasteland morning where the dust has settled and the stars are going out, and somewhere in the distance someone is building something new. Rest now. The wasteland will be here when you wake. The endings have settled into their shapes, and the narrators have finished speaking, and the silence that remains is yours to fill with whatever comes next, or simply to leave empty and let the sleep take you. The choices have been made. The consequences are already unfolding. And in the long quiet of the post-war world, where dust settles over broken highways and the stars still find their way through the haze, everything that was worth saving has been saved. The water is clean. The settlements are holding. The trade routes are moving under an old and patient sky. Sleep well. Thanks for watching. If you felt calm wandering through these soft moments, there's another video on the left of your screen. Maybe let it play as you settle in. It might guide you into an even deeper rest.